Picture a battlefield where the only law is the sword, where the victor faces no limits on their power, and the defeated have no rights to claim. This wasn't just a possibility. For much of human history, it was the terrifying reality of conflict, a world without a rulebook. But what if I told you that thousands of years before the Roman legions marched, ancient empires were already creating sophisticated legal documents to try and tame the chaos of war? Long before what we think of as international law existed, visionary leaders and their scribes were sitting down and drafting treaties, remarkable agreements that sought to bring a measure of humanity and order to the battlefield. These weren't just simple handshakes, they were detailed pacts that addressed prisoner treatment, defined borders, and laid out the consequences for breaking promises, establishing a revolutionary idea that even in war there could be rules. We often look to the Romans as the great lawmakers of antiquity, but the truth is, they were building on a foundation laid by forgotten empires whose diplomatic genius has been buried by the sands of time. This journey takes us back to a world of clashing chariots and mighty citadels, to the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and the Assyrians, cultures that understood that pure, unrestrained power was ultimately destructive, and that stability required something more. They discovered that principle and power had to find a balance, and they encoded that balance in clay and stone. In this video, we are going to explore 22 of these extraordinary ancient treaties, pacts that wrote the first rules of war and peace. We will unearth agreements forged in silver and inscribed on bronze tablets, deciphering the promises made between pharaohs and kings. You will see how they handled everything from the return of fugitive slaves to the sacred oaths sworn before a pantheon of gods, who are called upon as divine witnesses to punish any who dared break their word. We will uncover how a treaty could end decades of bloody warfare between two superpowers, creating a peace that lasted for generations, and how another could turn fierce nomadic raiders into loyal frontier guards through clever diplomacy and fair treatment. This is about more than just a list of old documents. It's a deep dive into the very origins of diplomacy, a look at humanity's first, fumbling, but ultimately profound attempts to create a system that was better than sheer annihilation. It's a story of ambition, fear, wisdom, and the enduring human desire to find a better way, even when surrounded by conflict. By understanding these ancient pacts, we gain a powerful lens through which to view our own world. The concepts they established: the idea of mutual respect between powers, the protocols for envoys, the very framework for negotiating peace, echo down the centuries, influencing everything from medieval charters to the Geneva Conventions. This exploration is not just an academic exercise, it is a quest to understand a fundamental part of our shared history, the moment we began to choose written law over unchecked might. So join me as we decode these historical mysteries, piecing together the fragments of the past to discover how our ancestors sought to impose order on chaos. We'll discover the origins of the rules that still, to this very day, shape how nations interact during conflict and in the precious moments of peace that follow. To truly grasp the significance of these ancient treaties, we first need to step into the world that created them. Picture the vast, interconnected landscape of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, a sprawling stage where powerful empires like Egypt, the Hittites in Anatolia, and the Assyrians in Mesopotamia were constantly jockeying for position. This was not a world of isolated kingdoms. It was a dynamic, often volatile, international system. Trade routes carrying lapis lazuli, tin, and luxury goods wove these powers together, but so did the ever-present threat of conflict over fertile river valleys, strategic mountain passes, and coveted resources. In such an environment where a single battle could shift the balance of power for a generation, the sheer cost of perpetual warfare became untenable. Rulers began to realize that there had to be a better way to manage their rivalries and secure their borders than through endless, draining campaigns. This pressing need for stability, for a way to predict and manage the behavior of other powerful states, is the fundamental crucible in which diplomacy was born. It was a practical response to a dangerous and expensive reality, a move from unpredictable raids and shifting alliances toward something more formal, more lasting, and more reliable. The administrative machinery to support this new diplomatic order was nothing short of revolutionary for its time. These civilizations developed sophisticated bureaucratic systems centered on a highly trained class of scribes. These individuals were far more than mere clerks. They were the legal scholars, diplomats, and record-keepers of their age. Using a stylus, they would meticulously press the intricate, wedge-shaped characters of cuneiform into soft clay tablets, or carve hieroglyphs into stone monuments known as stelae. This act of writing was transformative. An agreement was no longer just a verbal promise that could be forgotten, misinterpreted, or deliberately denied. By inscribing the terms, these societies created a permanent, tangible record. A treaty could be stored in a temple archive, a sacred space under divine protection, and then referenced years or even decades later to hold the parties accountable. This was the birth of documented law in the international sphere. The very physicality of these records, the weight of a clay tablet, the imposing presence of a stone pillar, lent the agreements an authority and a permanence that a simple handshake could never achieve. It established a precedent that would echo through history, that the most important promises between nations must be written down. At its heart, the emergence of the treaty represented a profound philosophical shift. For millennia, the prevailing doctrine in interstate relations had been a simple, brutal one: might makes right. The strongest army could take what it wanted, and the defeated had little recourse. The concept of a negotiated settlement, where two parties sat down and hammered out terms that acknowledged each other's interests, was a radical departure from this tradition. It was an admission that even the most powerful empire could not simply impose its will everywhere forever. It recognized that there was such a thing as mutual interest, a shared benefit in having a stable border, in fostering secure trade, or in presenting a united front against a common enemy. This was the dawn of a new mindset, one that valued long-term security and prosperity over short-term plunder. The individuals who negotiated these early accords were the unsung pioneers of statecraft. They had to navigate complex cultural differences, deep-seated mistrust, and the colossal egos of absolute monarchs, all while trying to secure a deal that would actually hold. Their ingenuity and foresight laid down the foundational principles of international relations, creating a template for negotiation and agreement that would be built upon, adapted, and refined for centuries to come, ultimately influencing the legal and diplomatic systems that shape our modern world. But to truly understand the power these documents held, we need to look beyond the political negotiations and into the very soul of ancient belief. A treaty was not merely a contract between kings. It was a sacred covenant, a pact sworn in the presence of the gods themselves. Imagine the solemn ceremony, two rulers representing entire peoples standing before an altar, calling upon their pantheons, the Egyptian sun god Ra, the Hittite storm god Teshub, the Assyrian national god Ashur, to bear witness. This was not a symbolic gesture. In the minds of everyone involved, these deities became the ultimate guarantors of the agreement. To break one's oath was not just a political miscalculation, it was a profound act of sacrilege, an offense that invited divine retribution not only upon the treacherous king but upon his entire nation. The curse clauses in these treaties are filled with vivid, terrifying imagery, invoking plagues, famine, and the utter destruction of cities, making it clear that the gods were seen as active enforcers. This spiritual dimension lifted the treaty from a temporary arrangement of convenience to a matter of eternal consequence, embedding the legal obligations within a framework of cosmic order and moral duty that was far more intimidating than any earthly penalty could ever be. This sacred seriousness was mirrored in the highly formalized structure of the documents themselves. While each treaty was unique, they often followed a recognizable legal blueprint that would feel familiar even today. It typically began with a preamble, much like the introduction to a modern law, which clearly identified the parties involved, often using grand titles like the Sun, the Great King of Hatti, and the Son of Ra, the Lord of the Two Lands, Pharaoh of Egypt. This established the identities and authority of the signatories right from the start. Following this came the substantive articles, the heart of the agreement, which laid out in meticulous detail the specific obligations of each party. These clauses could cover everything from military alliances and border demarcations to the extradition of political fugitives and the rights of merchants. The language was precise, leaving little room for ambiguity, and then came the section that truly highlights the ancient mindset, the curse formulae. Here, the scribes would list, in often gruesome and creative detail, the divine punishments that would befall anyone who violated the terms. This structure preamble, stipulations, curses created a comprehensive document that addressed legal, practical, and spiritual concerns all at once, demonstrating a holistic understanding of what it took to make a promise last. The individuals who brought these powerful agreements to life were the scribes and envoys, the unsung heroes of ancient diplomacy. An envoy was more than just a messenger. He was a trusted representative, often a high-ranking noble or even a member of the royal family, chosen for his eloquence, discretion, and deep understanding of foreign courts. His mission was perilous. He would travel for weeks or months, carrying preliminary terms and gifts, navigating not only treacherous geography, but also the even more treacherous waters of international politics. His goal was to negotiate in good faith, to read the intentions of a foreign king, and to secure terms favorable to his own ruler. Once a preliminary agreement was reached, the scribes took over. These were the legal experts and master linguists of their time. They would painstakingly draft the treaty text, often in both languages of the contracting parties, ensuring that every clause was perfectly articulated. The final document was then inscribed on durable materials, clay tablets that could be fired for permanence, or even on prestigious silver or bronze sheets, and then stored in the most secure and sacred places available, the inner sanctums of temples or the heavily guarded palace archives. This act of preservation was crucial. It meant the treaty was not a secret deal but a public monument, a permanent record that could be consulted, read aloud, and used to hold future generations accountable to the promises made by their ancestors. When we step back and view this ancient process in its entirety, the sacred oaths, the formal legal structure, the skilled diplomats, and the permanent temple-housed records, we see a system that blended the legal, the religious, and the diplomatic into a single, powerful tool for maintaining order. It was a holistic approach that recognized human nature and the need for commitments to be backed by more than just the threat of armies. They were underwritten by the fear of the gods, the force of law, and the weight of tradition. This integrated method stands in stark contrast to much of modern diplomacy, which often operates in a more secular and fragmented way, with legal agreements separate from cultural understanding and moral imperatives. Reflecting on the ancient way invites a compelling question. Have we, in our pursuit of purely rational statecraft, lost something vital? Perhaps there is a lesson in this blend of the sacred and the secular, a reminder that for a promise to truly endure, it must resonate on a level deeper than mere political expediency, touching the shared values and beliefs that bind communities together across generations. Our journey into these ancient rules of war and peace begins at a true turning point in history, with a document so significant it is often called the world's first recorded peace treaty. This is the Kadesh Peace Treaty, forged around 1259 BC between two colossal figures of the Bronze Age, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III. To understand its revolutionary nature, we must first appreciate the sheer scale of the conflict it ended. For decades, the Egyptian and Hittite empires had been locked in a brutal struggle for supremacy over the strategic lands of the Levant, a region that was the crossroads of the ancient world and the source of immense wealth and influence. The climactic moment of this long war was the Battle of Kadesh, a truly monumental clash of chariots and infantry that both sides would later claim as a great victory. In reality, it was more of a bloody stalemate, a grinding conflict that demonstrated to both empires the exhausting and unsustainable cost of their rivalry. They had fought to a standstill, and from that mutual exhaustion emerged a radical idea. Instead of continuing a fight neither could decisively win, they would choose peace. The treaty they created was a masterpiece of practical diplomacy. Its terms, which have survived for over 3,000 years, reveal a sophisticated understanding of what was needed to build a lasting peace. First and foremost, it established a clear and mutually recognized border between their spheres of influence, effectively saying, "This land is yours and this land is mine," which eliminated a major source of future disputes. But it went far beyond just drawing a line on a map. The two superpowers pledged a policy of non-aggression, swearing solemn oaths that they would not attack each other's territories. Even more remarkably, they entered into a mutual defense pact. The treaty explicitly stated that if a third party, another kingdom or invading force, were to attack either Egypt or Hatti, the other would come to its allies' aid. Imagine the profound shift in thinking. This required yesterday's mortal enemy was now your designated protector. This transformed their relationship from one of pure hostility into a strategic partnership designed to maintain regional stability against common threats. Furthermore, the agreement included what we would now call an extradition clause, a protocol for the return of political refugees or fugitives who might flee from one empire to the other. This prevented dissidents from using the border as a shield to plot against their former rulers, closing a potential loophole for conflict. The physical form of this treaty was as important as its words, designed to project power and ensure permanence. We know from historical records that the original agreement was inscribed on a tablet of silver, a precious metal associated with the moon god in Anatolia, and a material that spoke of immense prestige and divine favor. This was not a casual scroll of papyrus, it was a monumental object, later to publicize the achievement and cement its authority for all time. Both Ramesses and Hattusili had the full text of the treaty carved into the walls of their most important temples. In Egypt, you can still see it at Karnak. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, it was inscribed on the walls of a temple dedicated to the storm god. This act of public display was crucial. It meant the treaty was not a secret deal between two kings, but a public, eternal covenant between two nations, witnessed by their people and, most importantly, by their gods. The language used within the text further reinforced this bond. The pharaoh and the Hittite king referred to each other as brother, a powerful term of parity in the ancient diplomatic world that signaled they were dealing with each other as equals, not as victor and vanquished. This careful construction of respect and ritual was key to the treaty's success, and successful it was. The Kadesh Peace Treaty did not just end a war, it created a peace that lasted for generations. It remained in force throughout the reigns of both Ramesses II and Hattusili III, and continued to be honored by their successors. This longevity is its most powerful testament. It demonstrates that this was not merely a temporary truce born of exhaustion, but a genuinely effective framework for coexistence that brought tangible benefits to both empires. With their contested border secured by a legal agreement, both Egypt and Hatti could redirect their vast resources away from constant military preparation and toward internal development, grand construction projects, and flourishing trade. The stability it provided allowed goods, ideas, and cultural influences to flow more freely across the ancient Near East. By choosing to codify their peace in such a durable and detailed way, these two ancient superpowers set a precedent that would echo for millennia. They proved that even the most bitter of enemies could, through diplomacy and a recognition of mutual interest, establish a set of rules to govern their relationship, transforming a battlefield of chaos into a landscape of ordered, predictable, and prosperous peace. While the Kadesh Treaty stands as a monumental achievement of the Bronze Age, our search for the origins of these rules takes us even further back in time, to an era of emerging empires and the very dawn of recorded diplomacy. Leapfrogging over 1,000 years before Ramesses and Hattusili sat down, we arrive in the world of the Akkadian Empire, the first great multi-ethnic state in history, ruled by the powerful King Naram-Sin. Around 2250 BCE, his administration crafted an agreement with a neighboring Elamite ruler, a pact that survives today only in fragments but whose significance is immense. This treaty is not just old, it is one of the oldest surviving written agreements between two major powers ever discovered, a fragile cuneiform whisper from the depths of antiquity that fundamentally changes our understanding of how early states interacted. The world of Naram-Sin was one of fierce competition and burgeoning connections. The Akkadian Empire, centered in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a dynamic, expansionist power. To its east lay the formidable kingdom of Elam, a civilization based in what is now southwestern Iran, with its own distinct culture, language, and ambitions. These were not isolated entities. They were neighbors with a long, complex history of trade, rivalry, and conflict over valuable resources and strategic routes. The very existence of this treaty indicates that these two powers had reached a point where the costs and instability of constant confrontation outweighed the potential gains. They were learning, perhaps for the first time in such a formal way, that there was a strategic advantage to having a predictable relationship with a powerful neighbor, even if that relationship was built on a foundation of cautious respect rather than warm friendship. The fragmentary text of the agreement, painstakingly pieced together by archaeologists from broken clay tablets, reveals a surprisingly modern and pragmatic set of concerns. It wasn't solely focused on grand declarations of peace or war. It got down to the nitty-gritty of interstate relations. A major component was trade. The treaty established protocols for merchants, ensuring the safe passage of goods between the two empires. This was absolutely critical in an economy that relied on the flow of essential materials like metals, timber, and luxury items. By guaranteeing the security of commercial caravans, both kingdoms could enjoy economic prosperity and access to resources they lacked within their own borders. But economics were inseparable from security. The treaty also contained clauses for military support, likely pledging that one party would come to the aid of the other if attacked by a third party, perhaps a common enemy from the restive Zagros Mountains or a rival city-state. This intertwining of commerce and defense shows that even 4,000 years ago, rulers understood that true stability required both economic interdependence and a credible security guarantee. One of the most telling aspects of the treaty's language is its suggestion of parity. Unlike later Assyrian treaties that were blatantly imposed by a dominant power on a weaker vassal, the accord between Naram-Sin and the Elamite ruler seems to acknowledge both parties as sovereign equals. They negotiated with each other rather than one dictating terms to the other. This mutual recognition of status was a crucial diplomatic development. It meant that both empires were willing to treat each other with a degree of respect, acknowledging that the other possessed the military and political power to make a treaty worthwhile. This concept of parity was the bedrock upon which more stable long-term relationships could be built, moving beyond the simple binary of total domination or total war. It created a space for diplomacy to flourish. The mechanisms used to cement this alliance were also highly revealing of ancient statecraft. The treaty almost certainly involved the formal exchange of gifts. In the ancient world, gift-giving was not a casual act of generosity. It was a powerful political tool. Lavish presents, precious metals, finely crafted weapons, rare textiles served multiple purposes. They demonstrated wealth and power, they created a relationship of reciprocal obligation, and they symbolized the mutual goodwill that was supposed to underpin the written agreement. More strikingly, it is highly probable that the treaty involved an exchange of hostages. This doesn't mean prisoners in a dungeon, but rather high-ranking individuals, often members of the royal family or nobles, who would be sent to live at the foreign court. These individuals served as living guarantors of the treaty's terms. Their well-being, and indeed their very lives, were implicitly tied to their home kingdom's good behavior. This practice, which seems harsh to modern sensibilities, was a very concrete way to build trust. Having your son or brother residing in the capital of a rival power was a powerful incentive to honor your commitments, as any betrayal would place their lives in immediate jeopardy. The physical medium of this agreement, the cuneiform tablet, is itself a character in this story. Scribes, using a stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, created a permanent legal record. This act of writing transformed a verbal promise into a binding document that could be stored in a palace or temple archive and referenced years later. The very fact that we can read these terms today, despite the tablets being broken and worn by millennia, is a testament to the importance these civilizations placed on the written word as a tool of governance and international law. The treaty between Naram-Sin and the Elamite ruler, in all its fragmented glory, is a powerful testament to a foundational truth of human society. It shows us that at the very dawn of empire, states had already discovered a profound truth, that relentless warfare was a dead end. They recognized that through formalized cooperation, through negotiated agreements that respected sovereignty and intertwined their economic and security interests, they could achieve a stability and prosperity that conquest alone could never guarantee. This early experiment in diplomacy set a vital precedent, establishing principles of parity and mutual interest that would be tested, refined, and sometimes forgotten, but would forever remain a part of the diplomatic toolkit. Now, let's shift our focus from the grand stage of empires to a smaller, yet no less revealing, theater of ancient politics. In the mid-2nd millennium BC, the kingdom of Alalakh was a modest but strategically important city-state nestled in the Amak River Valley, in what is now the border region between Turkey and Syria. This was the world of Idrimi, a king whose own life story, recorded on a famous statue inscription, reads like an epic tale of exile and restoration. His treaty with a neighboring ruler named Pilia offers us a priceless, ground-level view of how diplomacy functioned for the smaller players caught between the great powers of the day, like the Hittites to the north and the Mitannians to the east. This wasn't a pact between superpowers, it was an agreement between two local kings trying to secure their own survival in a dangerous neighborhood, and its clauses reveal the intricate dance of obligation and autonomy that defined life in the shadow of empires. The terms of the Alalakh Treaty are remarkably practical, focusing on the everyday mechanics of power and mutual need. One of the most significant obligations laid out was the requirement for troop contributions. This meant that King Idrimi was likely expected to supply a contingent of his own soldiers to fight in the army of his larger overlord, or perhaps to support Pilia in a local conflict. For a smaller state, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a heavy burden, draining their own military strength and potentially leading to the deaths of their citizens in another ruler's war. On the other hand, it was a way to demonstrate loyalty and value, proving themselves as a reliable ally worth protecting. Alongside soldiers came tribute payments, regular deliveries of valuable goods like grain, olive oil, metals, or crafted items. This tribute was the economic lifeblood of the hierarchical system, a tangible flow of wealth from the periphery to the center that funded the imperial court and its military ambitions. For Idrimi, paying tribute was the price of his throne, a necessary acknowledgement of his subordinate position in the political food chain, perhaps one of the most telling clauses, and one that speaks to the social and economic realities of the time, concerns the return of fugitive slaves. In an agrarian society where wealth was measured in land and labor, a runaway slave represented a direct loss of property and productivity. The treaty makes it clear that if a slave fled from Idrimi's territory into Pilia's, or vice versa, the local authorities were obligated to capture and return that individual. This wasn't just about recovering lost assets, it was about maintaining the established social order. Allowing neighboring kingdoms to become havens for fugitives would have destabilized the entire region's labor system and created friction between rulers. By agreeing to this mutual extradition of slaves, Idrimi and Pilia were reinforcing a shared interest in upholding the status quo and preventing their border from becoming a source of social unrest. It shows that ancient treaties often dealt with the granular details of daily life and economics, not just the high politics of war and peace, but the true diplomatic genius of this agreement lies in its provision for arbitration. The treaty explicitly states that if a dispute arises between the two kings, they will not immediately resort to arms. Instead, they will bring their grievance before a third party for judgment. This is a breathtakingly sophisticated concept for its time, a formal, pre-agreed mechanism for conflict resolution that deliberately avoids military escalation. We don't know the exact identity of these arbitrators, but they were likely respected elders, priests, or perhaps even representatives from the suzerain power, the great king who stood above them both. This clause reveals a profound understanding that minor disagreements were inevitable, but that war was a costly and often disproportionate response. By creating a peaceful pathway to settle their differences, they were investing in the long-term stability of their relationship and their region. It represents an early, clear-eyed recognition that the rule of law, even in a rudimentary form, was a more effective tool for maintaining order than the constant threat of violence. The physical discovery of this treaty in the archives of Alalakh itself underscores a critical point about ancient administration. This wasn't a solitary monument carved on a public wall. It was a working document, a clay tablet filed away with other state records in the palace. Its presence there tells us that treaties were active instruments of policy, regularly consulted by scribes and officials to verify obligations and hold the other party accountable. The written record was the memory of the state, and its meticulous preservation was essential for the treaty to have any force. This reliance on documentation allowed for a degree of political continuity and accountability that would have been impossible in a purely oral culture. A king's successor could pull the tablet from the archive and know exactly what commitments his predecessor had made, ensuring that the agreements binding the kingdom transcended the lifespan of any single ruler. When we piece together these elements, the troop levies, the tribute, the return of fugitives, and the arbitration clause, the Alalakh Treaty paints a vivid picture of the constrained sovereignty of a smaller state. King Idrami was not a free agent. His power was circumscribed by his obligations to a larger power and his need to maintain stable relations with his neighbors. Yet the treaty also empowered him. It gave his rule a degree of legitimacy and external protection. It provided a clear framework for his relationship with Philia, reducing uncertainty and creating a predictable environment in which trade and agriculture could flourish. This delicate balance between empowerment and constraint is the central story of vassalage. A smaller kingdom traded a measure of its independence for the security and stability that came with being part of a larger political system. The treaty was the legal instrument that defined the terms of that trade, setting the stage for the far more elaborate and rigid systems of alliance and dependency that would be perfected by empires like the Hittites and the Assyrians in the centuries to come. From the intricate local politics of Alalakh, we now ascend back to the grand chessboard of empires, where the stakes were nothing less than the control of the entire Near East. Our next treaty is a breathtaking example of imperial statecraft at its most calculated and effective. In the 14th century BCE, the Hittite Empire, under its formidable and ambitious king Suppiluliuma I, faced a critical geopolitical challenge. The once mighty kingdom of Mitanni, a rival power to the east, was teetering on the brink of collapse, torn apart by a vicious dynastic civil war. This presented Suppiluliuma with a golden opportunity. He could have simply invaded and attempted to conquer Mitanni outright, but that would have been a costly and messy endeavor, likely provoking other regional powers. Instead, he chose a more sophisticated and ultimately more durable strategy. He would not destroy Mitanni, but rather he would take control of it from the inside. His instrument for this audacious plan was a prince named Shattiwaza, a claimant to the Mitannian throne who had been driven into exile. Suppiluliuma offered Shattiwaza a deal: Hittite military support to reclaim his birthright, in exchange for his total and unwavering loyalty. The treaty they signed is a masterclass in turning a rival kingdom into a client state, a legal blueprint for imperial domination that reveals how the Hittites built and managed their sphere of influence. The terms of this agreement were meticulously designed to ensure that Shattiwaza's restored kingdom would be permanently tethered to and dependent upon the Hittite Empire. At its core were ironclad loyalty clauses. Shattiwaza was not just expected to be a friendly neighbor, he was legally bound to be a loyal servant. The treaty explicitly stated that he must regard the Hittite king as his overlord. His interests must always align with those of Hatti, and his very right to rule was contingent upon his faithful service. This was cemented by a classic tool of ancient diplomacy, the dynastic marriage. Suppiluliuma gave one of his own daughters to Shattiwaza in marriage. This was far more than a symbolic gesture. It created a blood tie between the two royal houses, making the future sons of Shattiwaza and the Hittite princess the grandsons of the great Suppiluliuma himself. This gave the Hittite king a direct familial stake in the Mitannian succession, guaranteeing that Hittite influence would extend well into the next generation and tying the fledgling dynasty's legitimacy directly back to Hattusa. Perhaps the most strategically brilliant clause in the entire treaty was the one that forbade Shattiwaza from conducting any independent foreign policy. He was strictly prohibited from making separate treaties or alliances with any other power. This single provision was a diplomatic masterstroke aimed squarely at isolating the rising power of Assyria, a common rival that both the Hittites and the weakened Mitanni feared. By legally locking Mitanni into an exclusive relationship with Hatti, Suppiluliuma effectively created a buffer state on his eastern frontier. A friendly Mitanni would block Assyrian expansion westward, forcing the Assyrians to confront a Hittite-backed ally before they could ever threaten the Hittite heartland. This turned Shattiwaza's kingdom into a strategic shield, bought not with the constant deployment of Hittite legions, but with the powerful, enduring ink of a legal document. It demonstrates a profound understanding of power projection. That influence, when properly codified, can be a far more efficient and stable tool of empire than brute force alone. To ensure that Shattiwaza and his successors never forgot the gravity of their commitments, the treaty concluded with an extensive and terrifying list of divine curses. This was the spiritual enforcement mechanism of the ancient world. The document called upon the entire pantheon of Hittite and Hurrian gods, the sun gods of heaven and earth, the storm god Teshub, the goddess of love and war Ishtar, and many others, to act as witnesses and enforcers. The curses described in vivid, gruesome detail the fate that would befall anyone who broke the oath. They invoked everything from the complete obliteration of Shattiwaza's royal line and the desolation of his land to personal afflictions like blindness and leprosy. In the mindset of the time, this was not mere poetic flourish. It was a genuine and potent threat. By swearing this oath, Shattiwaza was understood to have placed not just his political future, but his very soul and the welfare of his entire people into the hands of the gods. The consequence of betrayal was framed not as a simple political setback, but as a cosmic catastrophe. This religious dimension gave the treaty a psychological power that mere secular penalties could never match, deeply embedding the fear of divine retribution into the heart of the political agreement. When we step back and view this treaty as a whole, we see the inner workings of ancient empire building with remarkable clarity. Suppiluliuma I was not just a conqueror. He was a master strategist who understood that lasting control often required working through local structures rather than simply erasing them. By installing a pliable native ruler like Shattiwaza, he gained a compliant ally in a strategically vital region without the immense cost and resentment that would come from direct military occupation. The treaty was the legal framework that made this entire system work. It transformed a relationship of raw power into one of defined rights and responsibilities, creating a predictable and stable order. This Hittite-Mitanni Accord stands as a powerful testament to the sophistication of Bronze Age statecraft. It shows us that the greatest empires were built not only on the strength of their armies but also on the power of their parchments, using carefully crafted words to weave networks of allegiance that could secure borders, isolate rivals, and project influence across the vast and turbulent landscape of the ancient world. While the treaty with Shattiwaza showcased Hittite power projection over a foreign kingdom, their diplomatic genius was equally evident in managing relationships within their own sprawling empire. This brings us to a truly remarkable document, a 13th century BCE accord between the Hittite great king Tudhaliya IV and his cousin, Kuranta, the king of Tarhantassa. Tarhantassa was not a foreign land conquered in battle. It was a major Hittite appanage kingdom, a semi-autonomous region in southern Anatolia ruled by a branch of the royal family itself. The treaty between these two relatives is a fascinating study in internal diplomacy, a carefully calibrated instrument designed to balance the central authority of the Hittite crown with the legitimate ambitions and needs of a powerful regional ruler. It demonstrates that the greatest challenge for an empire was not always defeating external enemies, but rather governing its own diverse and potentially rebellious territories with a blend of firmness and flexibility. The terms of this agreement are a masterclass in practical and preventative statecraft. It begins with a meticulous, almost obsessive, definition of the borders of Tarhantassa. The text doesn't just name general regions, it describes the frontiers in precise detail, listing specific towns, rivers, and mountain peaks that mark the boundary lines. This was legal precision of the highest order, intended to eliminate any future ambiguity or territorial disputes between Tudhaliya's central government and Kuranta's kingdom before they could even arise. But the treaty goes far beyond just drawing lines on a map. It delves into the very resources that made those lands valuable, explicitly guaranteeing Kuranta's rights to essential water sources and vital grazing pastures for his livestock. This reveals a sophisticated understanding that political stability was inextricably linked to economic prosperity. A regional king who could not provide for his people, who faced drought or famine because he was denied access to water, would be a weak and unreliable ally. By legally enshrining these economic rights, Tudhaliya was not just being generous, he was making a shrewd investment in the long-term stability of his empire's southern flank, ensuring that Tarhantassa would remain a prosperous and contented part of the Hittite world. The military obligations outlined in the treaty further illustrate this delicate balance of power and mutual need. Kuranta pledged his unwavering loyalty and military support to the great king. In the event of a foreign invasion or a major internal rebellion, the armies of Tarhantassa were expected to march under the Hittite banner. This was the non-negotiable core of the agreement, the fundamental duty of a vassal king to his overlord. Yet, the very existence of such a formal, written treaty suggests that Kuranta's position was one of significant strength and privilege. This was not the top-down diktat of an Assyrian emperor to a terrified city-state ruler. It was a negotiation between two powerful members of the same royal dynasty. The treaty implicitly acknowledged that Kuranta commanded substantial military forces of his own, and that his willing cooperation was far more valuable than his coerced submission. The Mutual Defense Clause was a two-way street, binding the central power to come to the aid of Tarhantassa if it were attacked, reinforcing the idea that this was a partnership for collective security, not merely an extraction of resources and soldiers from a subordinate. The physical object that carried this weighty agreement was itself a powerful statement. Unlike the more common clay tablets, this treaty was inscribed on a tablet of bronze. In the ancient world, the choice of material was never accidental. Clay, while durable when fired, could still break. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was costly, difficult to produce, and symbolized permanence, strength, and immense prestige. Crafting a treaty on bronze was like sealing it in titanium. It was meant to last for eternity, to be an unchangeable, monumental record of the accord. This was not a document to be filed away and forgotten. It was a public, monumental testimony to the special status of Tarhantassa and the solemnity of the promises made between Tudhaliya and Kuranta. The bronze tablet screamed to the world and to future generations that this agreement was fundamental to the structural integrity of the Hittite Empire, a cornerstone of imperial governance that was intended to withstand the pressures of time and politics. Beyond the rigid legal clauses, the treaty reveals a profound understanding of the human element in diplomacy. it includes provisions for regular communication and the exchange of gifts between the two courts. This might seem like a minor formality to us, but in the context of ancient kingship, it was absolutely critical. In an era without instant communication, a relationship between a supreme ruler and a powerful subordinate could easily fray through neglect, suspicion, or the whispers of courtiers. By mandating regular messengers and the exchange of lavish presents, whether fine weapons, ceremonial textiles, or prized animals, the treaty actively worked to maintain a personal bond between Tudhaliya and Kuranta. These gifts were a language of their own, a continuous reaffirmation of respect, goodwill, and mutual recognition. They kept the channels of communication open, allowing the two kings to address small issues before they escalated into major crises. This focus on relationship management shows that the Hittites understood a timeless truth of leadership, that laws and borders are necessary, but trust and personal connection are the glue that truly holds political alliances together, especially within a family dynasty where rivalries could be as dangerous as any foreign invasion. When we synthesize all these elements, the precise borders, the guaranteed economic rights, the mutual defense pact, the bronze medium, and the nurturing of personal ties, we see the Hittite Empire operating at the peak of its administrative sophistication. This was not a crude, centralized autocracy demanding blind obedience. It was a complex, layered state that recognized the value of incorporating powerful regional identities rather than crushing them. The treaty granted Kuranta to a significant degree of autonomy to manage his own affairs, which in turn fostered local loyalty and efficient governance. In exchange, it secured his formal allegiance and military resources for the empire as a whole. This nuanced approach to internal relations allowed the Hittites to govern a vast and geographically diverse territory for centuries. It stands in stark contrast to the more brutal, extractive methods employed by some later empires, reminding us that ancient statecraft was a subtle art. The agreement between Tudhaliya IV and Kuranta is a powerful testament to the idea that effective rule is often less about domination and more about the careful, deliberate, and legally codified balancing of power, privilege, and mutual interest. But as we move forward in time from the nuanced internal politics of the Hittites, we encounter a starkly different vision of empire and diplomacy. Enter the Neo-Assyrian Empire of the 8th century BCE, a militaristic powerhouse whose name became synonymous with terror and overwhelming force. Their approach to treaty-making was not about balancing interests or fostering partnership. It was about total, unyielding domination. This shift in philosophy is perfectly crystallized in the treaty imposed by King Ashurnari V upon Matiulu, the ruler of the Syrian city-state of Arpad. This document is not a negotiation between relative equals, nor is it a careful calibration of autonomy and obligation. It is a one-sided ultimatum, a chilling legal instrument designed to strip a smaller kingdom of its sovereignty and bind it in chains of absolute loyalty, enforced not by mutual benefit, but by the sheer, terrifying threat of divine and earthly annihilation. The very soul of this Assyrian treaty lies in its curse clauses, which transcend mere legal warnings and venture into the realm of psychological warfare. The text does not simply say that bad things will happen if Matiulu breaks his oath. It paints a visceral, horrifying picture of his fate, described in excruciating detail, meant to haunt his every waking moment. The curses invoke a pantheon of Assyrian and local gods to serve as divine executioners. They promise that Matiulu will be treated like a sacrificial animal, that his land will be sold for a pittance, his people scattered like chaff in the wind. One particularly gruesome passage describes a series of physical degradations, wishing that he be afflicted with a fatal disease, that his bowels and organs suffer and fail. The language is deliberately graphic and humiliating, designed to instill a deep, primal fear. This was not just about securing political compliance, it was about breaking the spirit of the vassal king, making the very thought of rebellion so terrifying that it became unthinkable. In the Hittite treaties, the gods were solemn witnesses. In the Assyrian world, they were divine torturers, their wrath meticulously catalogued to ensure the vassal's paralysis through dread. The political and military terms of the treaty were just as absolute and restrictive as the spiritual threats. The cornerstone of the agreement was a complete surrender of Arpad's independent foreign policy. Matielu was strictly and explicitly forbidden from making any separate treaties, alliances, or even friendly communications with any other state. He could not listen to the envoys of rival powers like Urartu or Phrygia. He could not entertain offers of support from neighboring Syrian kings. This diplomatic isolation was a classic imperial strategy of divide and rule. By legally severing Arpad from the web of potential alliances that could have provided a counterweight to Assyrian power, Ashurnari V ensured that the city stood alone and vulnerable. Any attempt to reach out for help would itself be a treaty violation, giving the Assyrians a perfect legal pretext for a devastating punitive campaign. This clause transformed Matielu from a ruler with options into a political prisoner in his own palace. His kingdom transformed from an ally into an isolated outpost of the Assyrian Empire, its fate entirely dependent on the whims of its overlord. Furthermore, the treaty demanded unconditional and proactive support for Assyria's relentless military campaigns. Matielu was not just expected to defend his own territory. He was obligated to contribute his own soldiers and resources to the Assyrian war machine whenever and wherever the great king demanded. His troops would be expected to march, fight, and die in wars that served purely Assyrian interests, often far from their homeland. This was the economic and human cost of vassalage under the Assyrian model, a constant drain on the smaller state's manpower and treasury to fuel the very empire that held it in subjugation. There was no room for negotiation or excuse. Refusing a call to arms was as grave a sin as openly rebelling. This system effectively turned conquered territories into forward operating bases and resource depots, their local rulers into glorified provincial governors who just happened to wear a crown. The treaty was the legal mechanism that normalized this extraction, framing it not as plunder, but as a solemn, non-negotiable obligation. When we place this treaty next to the one between Tudhaliya and Kuranta, the contrast in imperial style could not be more dramatic. The Hittites often sought to integrate powerful regional players, offering them a measure of dignity and autonomy in exchange for their loyalty. The relationship, while hierarchical, contained elements of mutual respect and a recognition of shared dynasty. The Assyrians, in contrast, pursued a strategy of pure coercion. Their treaties were not partnerships, they were instruments of pure power, deliberately highlighting the vast disparity between the almighty empire and the helpless vassal. The language is not one of brotherhood but of master and servant. This top-down, oppressive approach reflects the core Assyrian imperial ideology. The king was the absolute, unchallenged master of the world, and all other rulers were merely his slaves, their existence justified only by their utility to the Assyrian state. The treaty with Matielu was a performative enactment of this ideology, a public ritual of subjugation designed to humiliate the vassal and demonstrate his complete powerlessness to his own people and to the wider world. This method, while brutally effective in the short term, carried the seeds of its own long-term instability. A kingdom bound only by fear, with no stake in the success of the empire, is a kingdom always waiting for a moment of weakness. The resentment fostered by such harsh and humiliating terms ensured that the moment the Assyrian army was distracted or defeated elsewhere, rebellions would erupt across the empire. The very fear that secured compliance also guaranteed that the compliance was brittle and temporary. The history of the Assyrian Empire is, in fact, a relentless cycle of conquest, harsh subjugation, rebellion, and reconquest. The Treaty of Ashkenazari and Matiulu exemplifies this exhausting cycle. It reveals the dark potential of diplomacy when it is stripped of all reciprocity and becomes merely a velvet glove over an iron fist. This coercive model stands as a sobering counterpoint to the more collaborative approaches we've seen, reminding us that ancient statecraft existed on a broad spectrum, from the art of building consensus to the science of imposing terror. Yet, even within the rigid, fear-based framework of the Assyrian Empire, we find fascinating exceptions that reveal a more pragmatic and nuanced side to their rule. The treaty between King Esarhaddon and Baal, the ruler of the powerful Phoenician city of Tyre, stands out as a brilliant example of this calculated flexibility. By the 7th century BC, the Assyrian war machine had reached its zenith, but its kings were learning that some territories were far more valuable intact and cooperative than they were crushed and plundered. Tyre was not just another city-state, it was the undisputed queen of the Mediterranean, a wealthy island metropolis whose merchant fleets formed the backbone of international trade, connecting the entire Near East to the riches of the wider world. For Esarhaddon, trying to govern Tyre with the same iron fist he used on inland kingdoms like Arpad would have been a catastrophic mistake. He understood that its wealth did not come from farmland or conscripted infantry, but from the skill of its sailors, the reach of its trade routes, and the unique knowledge of its shipbuilders and purple dye manufacturers. This recognition led to a treaty that was less a demand for submission and more a shrewd business partnership, where Assyrian military power and Phoenician commercial genius were bartered to the benefit of both. The terms of this agreement were a masterstroke of economic statecraft. In exchange for his formal loyalty and the payment of a regular tribute, Esarhaddon granted Tyre a remarkable degree of autonomy. The Assyrians did not install a brutal garrison on the island or dictate the city's internal laws. Instead, the treaty focused on regulating and, crucially, protecting the commercial activities that made Tyre so indispensable. It guaranteed safe passage for Tyrian merchant ships throughout the eastern Mediterranean, which was effectively an Assyrian promise to use its own navy to suppress pirates and rival coastal cities that might threaten this maritime traffic. For the Tyrians, this was an incredible boon. Their lifeblood was commerce, and now the most powerful empire on earth was acting as their global security force. In return, the treaty ensured that the lucrative flow of goods, silver from Spain, tin from Anatolia, fine timber from Lebanon, and the legendary purple dye made from murex snails, would have a guaranteed and preferential route into the Assyrian heartland. The empire didn't just want a cut of the profits, it wanted to structurally integrate Tyre's economy into its own, making the city's prosperity a direct contributor to Assyria's treasury and prestige. This symbiotic relationship was further cemented by provisions for mutual assistance, but with a distinct Tyrian flavor. The treaty obligated King Baal to provide military support to Esarhaddon, but this likely took a very specific form. The Assyrians had a vast land army, but their naval capabilities were limited. The real value of Tyre's military contribution was its legendary fleet. In the event of a rebellion in a coastal province or a campaign against a rival power like Egypt, the Tyrian navy could transport Assyrian troops, blockade enemy ports, and control the sea lanes, capabilities the Assyrians simply could not replicate on their own. Conversely, the treaty promised Assyrian protection for Tyre itself. The city, though an island fortress, was vulnerable to sieges from the mainland or naval attacks from competitors. By formally placing Tyre under its protection, Assyria acted as a deterrent against any would-be aggressors. This created a powerful interdependence. Tyre gained the security it needed to conduct its business unmolested, and Assyria gained access to the strategic naval power and economic wealth that fueled its imperial ambitions. It was a classic case of each partner bringing their unique strength to the table to create an alliance that was greater than the sum of its parts. What makes this treaty so compelling is its stark departure from the pure coercion we saw with Arpad. Esarhaddon and his advisors realized that the relationship with a commercial powerhouse had to be managed with a lighter touch. Crushing Tyre would have meant destroying the very source of the wealth they sought to control. Instead, they created a framework that allowed Tyre to thrive, recognizing that a prosperous and semi-independent Tyre was a far greater asset to the empire than a desolate and rebellious one. This was not altruism, it was the coldest, most calculating form of realpolitik. The Assyrians were leveraging their overwhelming military power not to extinguish a rival, but to create a stable and highly profitable environment for a specialized partner. The treaty effectively outsourced the complex business of Mediterranean maritime trade to the experts, while the empire provided the security and large-scale market that made such trade so immensely profitable. This accord demonstrates that even the most militaristic empires could not survive on plunder and terror alone. Long-term stability and prosperity required the cultivation of cooperative relationships with key economic players, showing that ancient statecraft could be as much about nurturing golden geese as it was about wielding the sword. Now we arrive at a treaty that forces us to completely rethink what we mean by ancient diplomacy, moving from the marble palaces of emperors to the vast, wind-swept frontiers where empires literally met their limits. This is the world of Nebuchadnezzar II, the legendary Neo-Babylonian king famous for his monumental building projects and the subjugation of mighty kingdoms like Judah. But some of his most vital statecraft was directed not at other crowned heads, but at the powerful, fluid, and often misunderstood tribal confederations that roamed the edges of his cultivated lands. For an empire built on the wealth of irrigated fields and bustling cities, these nomadic tribes were not just a minor nuisance, they were a fundamental part of the political and economic ecosystem. They controlled the desert trade routes, possessed unique knowledge of water sources in arid lands, and could either be a devastating source of raids or a crucial line of defense against other invaders. Nebuchadnezzar's treaty with one such confederation was therefore not an act of condescension, but one of stark necessity and brilliant adaptation, creating a legal framework to manage a relationship that was entirely different from anything we've seen so far. The core of this agreement was profoundly practical, dealing with the three most volatile points of contact between a settled empire and a nomadic people: land, trade, and justice. First, it formally established grazing rights. For a pastoral tribe, their entire wealth and survival were tied to their herds of sheep, goats, and camels, and they needed access to seasonal pastures that often bordered or even overlapped with imperial farmland. Without a formal agreement, this was a recipe for constant conflict. A farmer's field ruined by a migrating herd could spark a cycle of violence that escalated for years. The treaty delineated where and when the tribes could graze their animals, turning a potential flashpoint into a regulated, predictable activity. This was a revolutionary act of recognition, acknowledging that the nomadic way of life had a legitimate place within the imperial order. Second, the pact secured trade routes. The tribes were the masters of the desert, and their cooperation was essential for the safe passage of the caravans that carried incense, spices, and precious metals from Arabia and beyond into the heart of Babylon. The treaty guaranteed their safety in tribal territories, and in return, the tribes gained access to the luxury goods and manufactured items of the city, from metal tools to fine textiles. This transformed the relationship from one of potential predation to one of mutual profit. Perhaps the most sophisticated element was the creation of conflict resolution mechanisms. The treaty didn't just lay down the law from the Babylonian perspective. It set up a process for arbitration. Disputes over a stolen animal, a damaged well, or a breach of the grazing agreement were to be brought before a mixed council of Babylonian officials and tribal elders. This prevented minor incidents from spiraling into open warfare. It was a formal admission that the empire's own courts and laws were not perfectly suited to adjudicating the complex, honor-based disputes of tribal society. By giving the tribal leaders an equal seat at the judicial table, Nebuchadnezzar was integrating their own legal traditions into the imperial system, granting them a measure of self-governance and showing respect for their authority. This wasn't just about imposing order, it was about building a hybrid system of justice that both parties could trust, a system that acknowledged the unique cultural codes of the frontier. Beyond the written clauses, this treaty was brought to life through powerful symbolic acts that were arguably as important as the legal text. The agreement was almost certainly ratified with elaborate gift exchanges and communal feasts. In the world of the ancient Near East, a gift was never just a gift. When Nebuchadnezzar presented the tribal sheikhs with ceremonial weapons, fine horses, or jewelry, he was doing more than buying their loyalty. He was publicly acknowledging their status as leaders, creating a bond of reciprocal obligation. By accepting these prestigious items, the leaders were in turn acknowledging the generosity and power of the great king. The feast was even more significant. Sharing a meal, especially in a desert culture where hospitality is a sacred duty, created a temporary but powerful bond of kinship. To break an oath sworn over a shared feast was a profound sacrilege. These rituals were the social and emotional glue that made the cold legal text of the treaty stick. They built the personal trust between the king's envoy and the tribal chief that was necessary for the agreement to survive the inevitable tensions and misunderstandings of life on the frontier. The ultimate genius of this treaty was its structure of integration without assimilation. Nebuchadnezzar was not trying to turn the nomadic tribes into settled Babylonian farmers. Such an effort would have been futile and destructive. Instead, the treaty recognized their autonomy and their unique way of life, formally bringing them into the imperial framework as distinct partners with specific rights and responsibilities. In exchange for grazing rights, safe trade, and a recognized judicial role, the tribes provided the empire with invaluable services. They acted as the empire's eyes and ears in the trackless desert, providing early warning of invasions from other powers. Their skilled and mobile warriors could be hired as auxiliary troops or used to police the very trade routes they now had a stake in protecting. By formalizing this symbiotic relationship, the treaty transformed a potential source of constant instability into a pillar of regional security. It reduced the costly skirmishes that drained the imperial treasury and facilitated a rich cultural exchange, as Babylonian goods and ideas filtered into the tribal world, and desert products and knowledge enriched the cities. This accord stands as a powerful testament to the flexibility of ancient diplomacy, proving that the most successful empires were those that could devise different tools for different challenges, understanding that managing a nomadic confederation required a completely different approach than dictating terms to a conquered city-state. But now we turn from agreements between kings to a covenant between a people and their God, moving from the international to the deeply internal. the covenant code found in the biblical book of Exodus, chapters 20 through 23, stands apart from the treaties we've examined. It is not a pact between Pharaoh and a Hittite king, but is presented as a divine revelation, a set of laws given by God to the Israelites, forming the core of their identity as a nation. While it is fundamentally a religious and legal document for a single community, its structure and content resonate so strongly with the secular treaties of the great empires that it reveals a shared legal language spanning the entire ancient Near East, showing how the very idea of a binding covenant could be adapted to shape the moral and social fabric of a society from the ground up. When we examine the laws within this code that pertain to warfare, we find a striking emphasis on ethical conduct that feels remarkably advanced for its time. The code introduces a principle that would be at home in any modern manual of war: the obligation to offer terms of peace before launching an assault on a city. This was not a suggestion, but a mandated legal procedure. An Israelite army was required to give a city the chance to surrender and accept vassal status before resorting to the horrors of a siege and sack. This single rule represents a monumental conceptual leap. It frames warfare not as an opportunity for unchecked plunder, but as a last resort, acknowledging that the goal is submission and stability, not mere destruction. Furthermore, the code lays out specific protections for non-combatants, particularly women who might be captured in war. While these protections fall far short of modern standards, they nonetheless imposed legal limits on what a victorious soldier could do, attempting to inject a measure of humanity into the chaotic aftermath of battle. These were not just military tactics. They were religious commandments, grounding the rules of war in a framework of divine justice and covenantal obligation, making ethical conduct in conflict a matter of faithfulness to God. Beyond the battlefield, the Covenant Code functions as a comprehensive constitution for a nascent society, covering an astonishing range of civil and criminal law. It meticulously outlines judicial procedures, insisting on the testimony of multiple witnesses to convict someone of a crime, a crucial safeguard against false accusations. It delves into property rights, detailing laws about restitution for theft or damage, whether to a neighbor's ox or their field. But perhaps most powerfully, it repeatedly addresses social justice, showing a profound concern for the most vulnerable members of the community. The code contains specific commandments to protect the stranger, the widow, and the orphan groups who, in the ancient world, had no powerful male protector and were THEREFORE, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. It even includes what we might call early environmental and labor laws, mandating that the land itself must have a Sabbath rest every 7 years, and that even a slave must be freed after a set period of service. This holistic vision demonstrates that for the Israelites, a well-ordered society was not just about punishing crime, but about actively creating a community founded on principles of fairness, compassion, and rest, all under the overarching authority of their God. The most compelling evidence of a shared ancient Near Eastern legal culture, however, lies in the Covenant Code structure, which mirrors the treaty formats of the Hittites and Mesopotamians with uncanny precision. Just like the treaty between a Hittite great king and his vassal, the biblical covenant begins by identifying the parties. I am the Lord your God, establishing the sovereign, and who brought you out of the land of Egypt, defining the people and their relationship to him. This is the preamble. What follows is the list of stipulations, the famous 10 Commandments, and the detailed case laws that follow, which are the equivalent of the treaty's substantive articles, laying out the specific obligations of the covenant people. And just as a Hittite treaty would conclude with a list of blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience, so too does the biblical narrative frame the covenant. The book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are filled with extensive blessings for faithfulness and terrifying curses for idolatry and covenant breaking, promising everything from agricultural abundance to military defeat and exile. This parallel structure is simply too specific to be a coincidence. It strongly suggests that the Israelite scribes who compiled and edited these traditions were operating within a common diplomatic and literary tradition, using a familiar legal form, the Suzerainty Treaty, to communicate their unique theological message that their relationship with God was one of a loyal vassal to a divine sovereign. This adaptation of the treaty form for internal governance reveals a brilliant theological and political innovation. In the great empires, a treaty was a tool for managing external relations, a contract between two human parties. In Israel, this concept was internalized and elevated. The entire nation was now in a treaty relationship, not with a human king in a distant capital, but with God himself. This transformed law from a merely human convention into a divine mandate, giving the social and ethical rules an ultimate authority and permanence. The covenant was the source of their collective identity. It defined them not just by a common bloodline or a piece of land, but by their shared commitment to a set of laws given by their God. This meant that justice for the widow and the orphan was not just a nice idea. It was a direct command from their sovereign. Honest weights and measures in the marketplace were a matter of covenant loyalty. By adopting this well-known legal form, the Israelite leaders grounded their entire societal project in a concept that was already understood to be binding, solemn, and of supreme importance. The Covenant Code, therefore, is far more than a list of ancient rules. It is a powerful demonstration of how a familiar diplomatic instrument could be repurposed to forge a community's conscience, creating a vision of a society ordered not by the whims of a pharaoh, but by the perceived demands of a just and holy God. From the careful management of nomadic tribes, we now turn to a grand alliance forged not for management, but for outright destruction. The story of the 10th Treaty is one of audacious ambition, a pact born from a shared, burning desire to topple a giant. In the turbulent early centuries of the first millennium BCE, the geopolitical landscape of the Near East was dominated by one seemingly unshakable power, the Assyrian Empire. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrian kings had built a military machine of unprecedented ferocity, their armies marching out year after year to crush rebellions, deport entire populations, and extract vast tributes from subject kingdoms. For the other major powers watching this expansion with growing dread, it was clear that standing alone meant being picked off one by one. It was in this climate of shared existential threat that two very different rulers made a momentous decision. Cyaxares, the king of the emerging Median Confederation in the Iranian highlands, and Nebuchadnezzar I, the ruler of the ancient and prestigious kingdom of Babylon in the south, decided to join forces. Their alliance was a classic example of realpolitik, proving that the enemy of my enemy is indeed my friend, and their treaty became the essential blueprint for bringing down a hegemonic superpower. The core of their agreement was a brutally simple and coordinated military strategy. This was not a vague promise of mutual goodwill. It was a detailed operational plan designed to stretch and shatter the Assyrian war machine. The Medes, renowned for their skilled cavalry and hardy infantry, would apply relentless pressure from the east and north, attacking the Assyrian heartland from the Iranian plateau. Simultaneously, the Babylonians, masters of siege warfare and fielding powerful armies of their own, would strike from the south, threatening the vital cities of Mesopotamia and cutting off key supply lines. This two-front war was a nightmare scenario for the Assyrian generals. They could no longer concentrate their formidable forces on a single enemy. They were forced to split their armies, rushing them back and forth across the empire to meet threats on opposite fronts. This coordination required an unprecedented level of trust and communication. The treaty would have established channels for sharing vital intelligence, details of Assyrian troop movements, the fortifications of key cities, and the political loyalties of vassal states. By pooling their knowledge, the allies could strike where the Assyrians were weakest and anticipate their counterattacks, turning the empire's own vast territory into a strategic liability. Beyond the battlefield, the treaty almost certainly included crucial political and social bonds to cement the partnership against the inevitable strains of a long war. The most powerful glue in the ancient diplomatic toolkit was the dynastic marriage. It is highly probable that a daughter of Cyaxares was given in marriage to a son of Nebuchadnezzar, or vice versa. This was far more than a symbolic gesture. It created a blood tie between the Median and Babylonian royal houses, making the success of the alliance a direct family matter for the next generation. A prince who was the grandson of both kings would have a powerful vested interest in maintaining the coalition his ancestors built. Furthermore, the treaty would have mandated regular diplomatic consultations. Envoys and trusted advisors would have traveled frequently between the two courts, not just to coordinate military campaigns, but to manage expectations, soothe bruised egos, and reaffirm their shared commitment to the ultimate goal. In an era without instant communication, this continuous personal engagement was essential to prevent the alliance from fracturing due to misunderstandings or the competing ambitions of the two partners, who were, after all, future rivals for regional dominance once their common enemy was gone. The ultimate success of this coalition was staggering. The combined pressure from the Medes and Babylonians, along with other opportunistic allies, proved too much for the Assyrian Empire to bear. One of the most pivotal moments in ancient history was the brutal sacking of the magnificent Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BC by the Median armies, an event that sent shockwaves across the civilized world. The Babylonians, for their part, solidified their control over the southern Mesopotamian plain, re-establishing their independence and ushering in a period of cultural renaissance. The treaty between Cyaxares and Nebuchadnezzar did not just win a war, it completely redrew the political map of the Near East. The terrifying colossus of Assyria was utterly dismantled, its cities burned and its administrative system shattered. In its place arose a new balance of power, a world now dominated by a triad of major players, the Medes, the Babylonians, and soon after, the Persians. This radical reshaping of the entire international order stands as a powerful testament to what could be achieved when rival powers set aside their differences and combined their strength against a common, overwhelming threat. This landmark alliance exemplifies a timeless strategic principle, the balancing coalition. Throughout history, whenever a single state has grown too powerful and begun to dominate its neighbors, those neighbors have consistently been driven to form alliances to counterbalance that power. The treaty between Media and Babylon is one of the earliest and clearest examples of this phenomenon in action. It demonstrates that diplomacy is not always about building lasting friendship. Sometimes, its most crucial function is to facilitate temporary, pragmatic partnerships for a specific, world-altering purpose. The diplomatic ingenuity on display was not in creating a perpetual peace, but in successfully managing the immense complexities of a multi-year, multi-front war between two very different cultures with their own separate agendas. They had to synchronize their marches, divide the vast spoils of a fallen empire in a way that felt fair, and maintain their solidarity right up to the moment of victory. The success of their treaty provided a playbook that would be studied and emulated for centuries, proving that even the most formidable empire is vulnerable to a united front of its determined adversaries. While the alliance between Media and Babylon shows us diplomacy at its most grand and strategic, our next treaty pulls us back to a more intimate, ground-level challenge that has faced civilizations for millennia. What to do about the neighbors who live just beyond the cultivated fields, who follow a different way of life and are often viewed with a mixture of fear and contempt. This brings us to the Old Babylonian period and a fascinating agreement forged by King Ammisajuka, who ruled in the 17th century BCE. His problem was the Suhtians, nomadic tribes who moved through the arid fringes of the Babylonian kingdom. To the sophisticated urbanites in the great cities like Babylon itself, the Suhtians were the quintessential other raiders, destabilizers, and a constant, low-grade threat to the prosperous agricultural settlements that formed the empire's economic backbone. They were the unpredictable force that could descend from the desert, strike a caravan or an outlying village, and then vanish back into the trackless wilderness, leaving frustration and fury in their wake. A lesser ruler might have responded with a simple, brutal policy of extermination, launching endless, costly, and largely futile punitive expeditions into the desert. But Ammisajuka chose a different path, one of remarkable foresight and pragmatism. He understood that you cannot simply wall out a people who are part of the landscape, and that perpetual conflict on the frontier was a drain the kingdom could ill afford. His treaty with the Suhtians was therefore a radical experiment in social engineering, an attempt to solve the problem of the nomad not with the sword, but with a carefully crafted offer of a place to belong. The core of Ammisajuka's strategy was a profound act of co-option. The treaty's central provision was an offer of settled lands. The Babylonian state would grant the Suhtian tribes designated territories on the frontier, lands where they could put down roots, cultivate crops, and establish permanent villages. This was a transformative proposal. For a nomadic people, settling down meant a fundamental shift in their entire identity, economy, and social structure. It meant exchanging the freedom and hardship of the desert for the security and constraints of agricultural life. In return for this gift of land, a resource that was both precious and a powerful symbol of belonging, the Suhtians were expected to pledge their loyalty to the Babylonian crown and, crucially, to provide military service. This was the brilliant twist. The very skills that made the Suhtians such effective raiders, their knowledge of the desert, their mobility, their endurance, and their martial prowess, were now to be harnessed for the state. They would be transformed from a threat on the periphery into the kingdom's first line of defense. They would patrol the very borders they once menaced, using their unique understanding of the terrain to guard against other, more hostile nomadic groups or to warn of approaching armies. Ammisajuka was essentially outsourcing his frontier security to the experts, turning poachers into gamekeepers in one masterful diplomatic stroke. But the treaty went far beyond this simple transaction of land for soldiers. It demonstrated a sophisticated understanding that true integration required legal and social inclusion. The accord included explicit provisions guaranteeing the Suhtians fair treatment under Babylonian law. This meant that if a dispute arose between a settled Babylonian farmer and a newly settled Suhtian, it would be adjudicated in a royal court, with the Suhtian entitled to the same legal protections and processes as any other subject of the king. This was a critical measure to prevent the newly settled tribes from becoming a permanent, exploited underclass. Without this legal standing, they would have been vulnerable to predation by local officials or powerful landowners, a situation that would have quickly bred the very resentment and instability the treaty was designed to prevent. By extending the umbrella of Babylonian law over them, Ammisajuka was signaling that they were not merely tolerated mercenaries, but were being brought into the fold of the civilization itself. This legal recognition was a powerful incentive for the Suhtians to buy into the new system, as it offered their families a level of predictability and justice that the harsh law of the desert could not always provide. This pragmatic approach stands in stark contrast to the more common imperial strategy of pure coercion, which we saw with the Assyrians. Ammisajuka was not trying to crush the Suhtians, he was trying to convert them. He recognized that the perpetual us versus them dynamic on the frontier was a zero-sum game that weakened the state. By offering incentives, land, protection, legal status, he was attempting to align the Suhtians' interests with those of the Babylonian kingdom. A settled Suhtian who owned a plot of land, whose children were growing up in a stable village, and who received regular provisions for his military service, had a tangible stake in the empire's stability. He was far less likely to raid the very system that now provided for his family. This policy was not just about pacification, it was about expansion of influence. Every Suhtian tribe that accepted the treaty terms effectively extended Babylonian soft power deeper into the frontier zone. They became living nodes of Babylonian culture, law, and economic activity, creating a buffer zone that was culturally mixed but politically loyal. This was a far more durable and cost-effective form of control than a string of isolated, expensive forts manned by reluctant conscripts from the heartland. Examining this ancient accord offers timeless lessons in managing diverse societies and securing turbulent border regions. The challenge Ammisajuka faced is one that has repeated itself throughout history, from the Roman limes dealing with Germanic tribes to modern nations grappling with integrating nomadic populations. His strategy highlights the limitations of a purely security-focused approach. Walls and armies can keep people out, but they cannot build lasting stability. The Babylonian Treaty, by contrast, sought to address the root causes of the conflict, competition for resources and a lack of belonging. By offering a pathway to integration, it attempted to turn a source of conflict into a source of strength. This method of engagement reminds us that the most resilient borders are not necessarily the most heavily fortified, but those where the people on both sides have a shared interest in peace and cooperation. Ammisajuka's pragmatism demonstrates that sometimes the bravest and most effective form of statecraft is not to defeat your enemy, but to find a way to make him your neighbor and ultimately your citizen. If the previous treaties showed the Assyrian capacity for pragmatic cooperation, the agreement imposed by Tiglath-Pileser III on a coalition of Levantine city-states reveals the darker, more manipulative side of their diplomatic playbook. This was not a negotiation, it was a deliberate and calculated act of political surgery, designed to dismantle resistance before it could even fully form. The situation Tiglath-Pileser faced was a classic problem for any expansionist empire. A group of smaller powers in the prosperous Levant, including states like Damascus, Tyre, and various Phoenician and Aramean cities, had begun to see the existential threat posed by Assyria's relentless march westward. Their instinct for self-preservation was pushing them toward unity, toward forming a coalition where their combined armies and resources could present a formidable challenge. For Tiglath-Pileser, allowing such a unified bloc to solidify was an unacceptable risk. His response was a masterstroke of divide-and-rule strategy, using the very instrument of a treaty not to make peace, but to legally mandate disunity and submission, transforming potential allies into isolated, competing vassals. The core mechanism of this treaty was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Tiglath-Pileser did not sign a single agreement with the coalition as a whole. Instead, he forced each individual member state, each king of Damascus, each ruler of Tyre, each prince of a smaller Aramean town, to swear a separate, identical oath of loyalty directly to him, the Assyrian great king. Within the text of each of these individual treaties was a devastating clause, a formal renunciation of all other mutual alliances. The king of Damascus was legally prohibited from making any pact with the king of Tyre. The ruler of a coastal city was forbidden from coming to the aid of an inland neighbor. This single provision systematically severed the political and military tendons that connected the Levantine states to one another. Where there had been the potential for a unified front, Tiglath-Pileser's treaty created a landscape of isolated, lonely city-states, each one legally bound to look only to Assyria for protection and command, and each one legally barred from looking to its neighbor for support. It was a diplomatic cage that turned their collective strength into individual weakness, ensuring that any future resistance would have to be undertaken alone, against the full, crushing weight of the imperial army. To ensure that no one was tempted to quietly rebuild those forbidden alliances, the treaty was backed by a system of terrifying penalties designed to make rebellion unthinkably costly. The text detailed the consequences of violation with chilling specificity. The most feared of these punishments was mass deportation. Entire populations, or at least their ruling elites, skilled artisans, and warrior classes, could be forcibly uprooted from their ancestral homes and transported hundreds of miles away to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. This served a dual purpose. It stripped a rebellious region of its leadership and productive capacity, and it replaced them with other deported peoples who had no historical connection to the land and therefore no motive to rebel. Alongside this demographic warfare came the confiscation of property. A king who broke his oath would not only lose his throne but all his personal wealth, his royal treasuries, his lands, and his palaces, all of which would be seized by the Assyrian crown and redistributed to loyalists. This economic threat struck directly at the source of a ruler's power, making the cost of defiance not just a matter of personal risk, but the utter annihilation of their dynasty's wealth and status for generations to come. The strategic genius of this approach becomes clear when we see it not as an isolated act of cruelty, but as a key component of a larger imperial system. By forcing each state into a direct, individual relationship with the Assyrian crown, Tiglath-Pileser effectively bypassed any existing local power structures. There was no intermediate level of authority, no regional council or coalition leader. Every local ruler reported directly to the king's representatives, creating a hub-and-spoke model of control with Assyria at the absolute center. This system made administration and taxation incredibly efficient for the empire. Tribute could be demanded from each city individually, with the failure of one having no impact on the obligations of the others. It also created a perverse form of competition among the vassals. A city might be tempted to report on its neighbor's disloyalty in the hope of gaining favor, or to pay its tribute more promptly to avoid being made an example of. The treaty, in this sense, engineered a system where the subject states were actively complicit in their own subjugation, policing one another out of fear and self-interest. When we contrast this treaty with the more cooperative one his predecessor Esarhaddon would later make with Tyre, the full spectrum of Assyrian diplomacy comes into view. Tiglath-Pileser's approach was for newly conquered, restive territories where the primary goal was to break the will to resist. It was a tool for consolidation and pacification. Esarhaddon's treaty with Tyre, which granted considerable autonomy in exchange for economic cooperation, was for a valuable, already pacified asset whose continued prosperity benefited the empire. Tiglath-Pileser's method was the hammer, Esarhaddon's was the scalpel. Both, however, served the same ultimate end, the strengthening and enrichment of Assyria. The treaty with the Levantine coalition stands as a sobering lesson in the use of legal instruments as weapons. It demonstrates that a treaty does not always signify peace or partnership. In the hands of a strategic imperialist, it can be a sophisticated device for disarming a region without firing a single shot, using the power of the written oath to shatter unity and enforce a peace that was, for the subjected, merely a quieter form of war. Now let's sail across the Mediterranean to a treaty that truly stretched the map, connecting two worlds that must have seemed almost mythical to each other. In the 7th century BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik I and King Gyges of Lydia, a realm in the rich highlands of western Anatolia, crafted an alliance that was extraordinary for its sheer geographical reach. At a time when a journey from the Nile Delta to the Lydian capital of Sardis could take months by land and sea, this was a venture of immense ambition. It speaks to a dawning realization that power and security were no longer just local concerns, that the tremors of a distant conflict or the allure of a far-off market could ripple across the known world. This wasn't diplomacy between next-door neighbors squabbling over a border river. This was an early form of global strategic thinking, an attempt to weave a thread of mutual interest across 1,000 miles of sea and rugged coastline, binding the ancient agricultural superpower of Egypt with the burgeoning financial powerhouse of Lydia. The engine driving this unlikely partnership was almost certainly a shared security threat that emerged from the volatile steppes to the north. Both kingdoms found themselves in the crosshairs of the Cimmerians, a fierce, nomadic confederation that came thundering out of what is now southern Russia and Ukraine. These were terrifying, mobile warriors, masters of horseback warfare who could strike with devastating speed, and they posed an existential danger to the settled, urban civilizations of the ancient world. For Gyges in Lydia, the Cimmerians were a direct and immediate menace, pressing against his borders and threatening the stability of his entire kingdom. For Psamtik in Egypt, the threat was more indirect but no less real. The chaos unleashed by the Cimmerian invasions could destabilize the entire eastern Mediterranean, disrupt the vital trade routes that brought timber and silver to the Nile, and even encourage other powers like the rising Assyrian Empire to take advantage of the disorder. A treaty of military cooperation, therefore, made perfect strategic sense. While we lack the specific battle plans, it is highly probable that the agreement involved some form of coordinated action. Perhaps Egyptian gold helped fund the Lydian armies holding the line in Anatolia, or maybe Psamtik's powerful navy helped secure the sea lanes, preventing the Cimmerians from receiving support by water. This long-distance alliance transformed a two-front problem for the nomads into a unified defensive front, demonstrating that even powers separated by vast distances could pool their resources to confront a common enemy. But the genius of this accord was that it was not built on fear alone. It was equally fueled by the powerful lure of mutual economic gain. This treaty was a classic case of complementary economies finding each other. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world, its fertile Nile Valley producing immense surpluses of grain, particularly wheat and barley. Lydia, in contrast, was famously mineral-rich. Its riverbeds glittered with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and its mines produced other valuable metals. The treaty would have formalized a trade relationship that was a dream for any economist. Egyptian grain would flow north to feed Lydia's growing urban centers and perhaps its armies, while Lydian gold, silver, and finely crafted luxury goods would flow south, enriching the Egyptian court and fueling its own ambitious building projects. This wasn't just barter, it was the creation of a sustainable economic circuit. The wealth generated by this exchange would have filled the treasuries of both kings, funding their militaries, financing their public works, and solidifying their political power at home. The treaty turned a potential military alliance of convenience into a deeply intertwined economic partnership, where the prosperity of one kingdom directly contributed to the strength of the other. To make this flow of people and goods possible, the treaty would have had to include very specific and practical clauses guaranteeing the safety of the individuals who made it all work, the merchants and the diplomats. In the perilous world of the 7th century BCE, a ship carrying a cargo of Lydian silver or a caravan of Egyptian papyrus was a tempting target for pirates, bandits, or even opportunistic local rulers. A simple promise of trade was meaningless without a guarantee of security. The treaty between Psamtik and Gyges almost certainly included formal provisions for safe passage. This would have meant that merchants carrying the official seal of either king could expect protection within the other's territories. Their goods would not be subject to arbitrary confiscation or exorbitant tolls, and they would be guaranteed fair access to markets and ports. Furthermore, the envoys who carried messages between the two courts, the human lifeline of the alliance, would have been granted the ancient equivalent of diplomatic immunity. Their persons were to be considered inviolable, ensuring that lines of communication remained open even during periods of tension. These seemingly mundane logistical details were, in fact, the bedrock of the entire agreement. They lowered the risk of long-distance trade, making it a predictable and profitable enterprise, which in turn encouraged more merchants to undertake the journey, weaving a thicker and more resilient web of connection between the two kingdoms with every successful voyage. The cultural impact of this partnership, while harder to trace in the archaeological record, would have been profound. For the first time, the Egyptian elite would have been exposed to the unique artistic styles of Lydia, perhaps in the form of intricately worked gold jewelry or distinctive pottery designs. The Lydians, famously credited with inventing coinage around this very time, may have seen their revolutionary stamped metal pieces begin to circulate in Egyptian markets, introducing a new concept of standardized value. Conversely, Egyptian artifact scarabs, faience amulets, or even the distinctive style of Egyptian statuary would have begun to appear in the halls of Sardis, symbols of a connection to an ancient and revered civilization. This was more than just an exchange of objects. It was an exchange of ideas, technologies, and aesthetic sensibilities. The treaty created a conduit through which cultural influences could flow in both directions, subtly shaping art, commerce, and even language in both regions. It offered both societies a window into a vastly different world, broadening their horizons and challenging any notions of isolation or cultural superiority. When we step back and consider the treaty between Psamtik I and Gyges in its entirety, its true significance comes into focus. This was not merely a bilateral agreement, it was a milestone in the shrinking of the ancient world. It represented a decisive break from the older model of diplomacy that was primarily concerned with immediate neighbors and local rivalries. Here, two powerful kingdoms looked past the complex political landscape of the Levant and the Aegean and saw a strategic partner on the far side of the map. Their alliance anticipated the deeply interconnected classical world that would follow, where the policies of Athens could be influenced by events in Persia, and the wealth of Egypt could be linked to the mines of Spain. It proved that diplomatic vision could overcome geography, that mutual interest could bridge vast cultural divides, and that the pursuit of security and prosperity was a truly international endeavor. This partnership laid the conceptual groundwork for the great networks of trade and alliance that would one day define the Hellenistic and Roman eras, reminding us that globalization is not a modern invention, but a very ancient human impulse. This treaty between Pharaoh Apries and the Greek city of Cyrene represents a fascinating pivot in the story of ancient diplomacy. Here, the focus shifts from managing internal imperial squabbles or confronting nomadic threats to something entirely new, building a formal bridge between two fundamentally different, yet equally proud civilizations. On one side was the Kingdom of Egypt, an ancient land-based power with a history stretching back millennia, its identity deeply rooted in the predictable rhythms of the Nile and the divine authority of its pharaohs. On the other was Cyrene, a vibrant but young Greek colony perched on the coast of North Africa, a daughter of the dynamic and competitive world of the Greek city-states, a maritime people whose lifeblood was commerce and whose political model was based on citizen participation. They were not just separate countries, they were different worlds. The very fact that they saw the need for a formal treaty speaks volumes about a changing Mediterranean, one where these distinct cultural spheres were beginning to overlap and interact in ways that required more than just occasional trade or sporadic conflict. Their agreement was a conscious effort to create a stable framework for that interaction, to turn a potentially volatile frontier into a zone of productive exchange. The immediate spark for the treaty was a very concrete and common problem, a border dispute. The fertile lands of Cyrenaica, the region around Cyrene, bled into the western fringes of Egypt's sphere of influence. Without a clear line, there was constant potential for clashes between Egyptian patrols and Greek settlers expanding their farmland, or disputes over precious water sources and grazing rights. This was the classic tinder that could ignite a much larger war. Rather than letting the situation escalate into a costly and unpredictable military confrontation, a prize and the leaders of Cyrene chose the diplomatic path. They sat down and negotiated a clear, mutually recognized border. This act, so simple in concept, was revolutionary in its effect. It replaced ambiguity with certainty and potential violence with a clear legal standard. By formally agreeing on where one territory ended and the other began, they eliminated the single greatest source of friction between them. This allowed both powers to focus their energies inward, on development and consolidation, rather than wasting resources on guarding a perpetually tense and ill-defined frontier. It was a testament to the pragmatic recognition that a clearly defined line on a map was a far cheaper and more effective tool of statecraft than 1,000 soldiers stationed in a desert outpost. But the treaty's vision extended far beyond simply drawing a line in the sand. Its true legacy lies in its proactive promotion of trade and the movement of people. The agreement explicitly allowed for the safe passage of merchants and goods between Egypt and Cyrene. This was a green light for economic integration. Greek merchants could now reliably bring their distinctive goods, fine olive oil, prized wines, and beautifully painted pottery into the Nile Delta, finding eager customers among the Egyptian elite. In return, the colossal grain surplus of Egypt, along with papyrus, linen, and gold, could flow westward to Cyrene and from there across the entire Greek world. This wasn't just about swapping products. It was about creating a stable economic circuit that enriched both parties. The predictability afforded by the treaty lowered the risk for merchants, encouraging more of them to undertake the journey, which in turn increased the volume and variety of goods available in both markets. This economic interdependence created a powerful incentive for both sides to maintain the peace. A pharaoh would think twice about disrupting a war that might cut off a valuable source of Greek silver or wine, just as the Cyrenes would be reluctant to jeopardize their access to the life-saving grain harvests of the Nile, especially during a local drought. The treaty, therefore, wove a thread of shared prosperity that made conflict a far less attractive option. This formal opening also had a profound, if less immediately obvious, cultural impact. For the first time on such a sanctioned and sustained scale, Egyptians and Greeks were given a structured opportunity to observe each other. Greek soldiers and traders, settling in the designated quarters of Nile Delta cities like Naucratis, would have encountered the staggering scale of Egyptian religion, the immensity of their temples, and their complex beliefs about the afterlife. Meanwhile, Egyptian envoys and merchants visiting Cyrene would have witnessed the bustling, noisy agora, the passionate debates of its citizen assembly, and the unique styles of Greek art and architecture. This was not a one-way street. Scholars have long noted the early influences of Egyptian sculpture on the developing Kouros statues of archaic Greece, and the flow of mathematical and astronomical knowledge from the Nile Valley to the budding philosophers of the Hellenic world was likely facilitated by the stable environment this treaty created. It allowed for a slow, steady osmosis of ideas, where each culture could borrow, adapt, and be inspired by the other without the pressure of conquest or the distortion of a master-servant relationship. This was a dialogue between equals, and it planted the seeds for the rich Hellenistic fusion that would blossom after Alexander the Great. Of course, the architects of this agreement were not naive idealists. They were practical leaders who understood that peace required a credible military foundation. The treaty therefore contained clear and binding non-aggression and mutual respect clauses. Both a prize and the government of Cyrene swore solemn oaths not to attack each other's territories or to allow their lands to be used as a base for hostile operations by a third party. This was a critical assurance. It meant that the pharaoh could focus his military attention on other threats, perhaps from the east or up the Nile, without constantly looking over his shoulder at his western frontier. For Cyrene, a relatively new colony surrounded by potential enemies, including powerful Libyan tribes, the guarantee that the mighty army of Egypt would not be massing on its border was an invaluable security dividend. This mutual pledge of non-aggression created a demilitarized zone of trust, a psychological buffer that was just as important as the physical one. It signaled a mature understanding that true security is not just about having strong defenses, but also about having predictable and peaceful neighbors. The treaty between a prize and Cyrene, therefore, stands as a quiet landmark in the history of the ancient world. It did not create a vast empire or topple a superpower, but it accomplished something perhaps more enduring. It built a bridge. At a time when most international relations were defined by hierarchy, vassalage, or outright conflict, this accord demonstrated the power of a different model, a model of coexistence and cooperation between two distinct cultural entities. It showed that diplomacy could be used not just to manage power, but to actively foster connectivity. By securing the border, encouraging trade, and guaranteeing peace, the pact created the stable conditions necessary for a deep and lasting cultural exchange to take root. It was one of the earliest and clearest blueprints for the integrated Mediterranean world that would define the classical age, a world where Greek ideas, Egyptian grain, and shared artistic styles would circulate freely from the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of the Levant. This was not the diplomacy of the sword or the treaty of the overlord. It was the diplomacy of the handshake, a formal agreement that recognized the immense benefits of looking across a cultural divide not as a barrier to be overcome by force, but as an opportunity to be explored through mutual respect and shared interest. Yet another remarkable thing about this treaty is the powerful role played by outside mediators, a concept that feels surprisingly modern. The prolonged and bloody stalemate between Lydia and Media had demonstrated that the two warring kings, Alyattes and Cyaxares, were too deeply entrenched in their conflict to find a way out on their own. Their pride, their resources, and their sense of honor were all locked into a struggle that neither could afford to lose, yet neither could decisively win. It was at this critical impasse that two other rulers stepped in to play a pivotal role, the king of Babylon and the ruler of Cilicia, a powerful kingdom on the southeastern coast of Anatolia. These were not disinterested bystanders. They were major regional players with a vested interest in seeing stability return to Anatolia. Constant warfare between Lydia and Media disrupted the intricate web of trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Aegean, threatening the economic prosperity of everyone in the region. The Babylonian king, in particular, represented one of the ancient world's oldest and most respected civilizations, lending his authority a tremendous weight. The Cilician ruler, positioned geographically between the two warring powers, had a direct stake in ending the conflict on his doorstep. Together, they acted as honest brokers, shuttling between the two courts, carrying proposals and counter-proposals, and using their diplomatic leverage to find a solution that would allow both Alliates and Cyaxares to save face. They reframed the discussion from one of victory and defeat to one of mutual benefit and long-term security. This was a brilliant early example of neutral third-party mediation, proving that sometimes the most difficult disputes can only be resolved when trusted outsiders help the combatants see a path to peace that their own anger and ambition had blinded them to. The treaty itself was a masterpiece of practical compromise, and its most enduring legacy was the establishment of the Halys River as the permanent, inviolable border between the two empires. If you look at a map of ancient Anatolia, the Halys River, known today as the Kızılırmak, forms a great, sweeping curve, a natural geographical feature that cuts across the heart of the peninsula. By choosing this major river as the boundary, the mediators selected a line that was clear, unambiguous, and easily defensible. There would be no future bickering over which hill or which valley belonged to whom. The river itself was the line. This eliminated a primary source of the conflict and created a stable, predictable frontier that soldiers on both sides could understand and patrol. For the Lydians, it secured their eastern flank, allowing them to consolidate their control over the wealthy Greek coastal cities and focus on becoming a maritime and commercial power. For the Medes, it firmly established their western limit, freeing them from a draining land war so they could turn their attention to consolidating their vast Iranian plateau and confronting other rivals, like the rising power of the Persians to their south. The Halys River border didn't just end a war, it created a new geopolitical reality in Anatolia, a balance of power that would hold for decades, providing the region with a precious period of stability that fostered economic and cultural growth for all the peoples living on both sides of the river. But the diplomats of the ancient world understood that a line on a map, even one as significant as a great river, was not enough to guarantee a lasting peace. Legal agreements needed to be reinforced by human bonds. This is where the treaty's second brilliant component came into play, the dynastic marriage. It was agreed that Alliate's daughter would be given in marriage to Astyages, the son of Cyaxares. In our modern era, we might view this as a cold and calculated exchange, but in the context of the ancient Near East, it was the most powerful glue available for sealing an alliance. A marriage between royal houses created a blood tie, transforming the relationship from one between two rival states into one between two branches of an extended family. The children produced by this union would be the grandchildren of both Alliates and Cyaxares, meaning that any future king of Media would have Lydian blood in his veins. This gave both dynasties a direct, personal stake in maintaining the peace. To attack your son-in-law's kingdom or your grandfather's realm was to attack your own family, an act that violated the deepest social and religious taboos of the time. The marriage alliance was a long-term investment in peace, designed to ensure that the spirit of the treaty would be honored not just by the signatories, but by their children and grandchildren. It was a recognition that the most durable treaties are those that intertwine the fates of the signing parties, making the cost of breaking the agreement not just a political or military calculation, but a profound personal and dynastic betrayal. The success of this diplomatic package was profound and far-reaching, with the Halys River border secure and the marriage alliance cementing the new relationship. Both the Lydian and Median empires entered a golden age of internal development. Freed from the colossal expense of a permanent war footing, King Alyattes and his famous son, Croesus, who would succeed him, could pour their kingdom's vast wealth, derived from the gold-rich riverbeds of their land, into monumental building projects in their capital of Sardis. They cultivated deeper trade relationships with the Greek cities on their coast, and Lydia, according to tradition, went on to invent the world's first standardized coinage, a revolution that would transform the global economy. The stability afforded by the treaty allowed them to focus on becoming synonymous with legendary wealth. Meanwhile, the Medes, under Cyaxares and then Astyages, solidified their control over the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from central Turkey to the borders of modern-day Afghanistan. They could now administer their vast territories without the constant distraction of a Western war, organizing their military and developing the administrative structures that their Persian successors would later inherit and perfect. The treaty didn't just stop a battle, it unlocked the potential of two great civilizations, allowing them to flourish and define their respective legacies, all because their leaders had finally accepted the wisdom of a negotiated compromise over the futility of a forever war. This remarkable agreement, born from a celestial event and forged through skilled mediation, stands as a timeless lesson in conflict resolution. It shows us that even the most intractable and long-running wars can be ended when the combatants are willing to accept a practical, rather than a total, victory. The treaty between Alyattes and Cyaxares underscores the immense value of compromise, the understanding that getting half of what you want through peace is infinitely better than losing everything in the pursuit of a complete but unattainable victory. It also highlights the indispensable role of external facilitators, those neutral parties who can de-escalate tensions, propose creative solutions, and help rivals see their shared interest in stability. In a world still grappling with seemingly endless conflicts, the story of this ancient treaty is a powerful reminder that the tools for peace, clear boundaries, interlinking alliances, and third-party diplomacy are not modern inventions. They are as ancient as war itself, and their successful application over 2,500 years ago on the banks of the Halys River proves that with wisdom and a willingness to negotiate, even the most bitter of enemies can choose to lay down their arms and build a more prosperous future. To understand the fateful pact between Nebuchadnezzar II and King Jehoiakim of Judah, we must first step into the terrifying geopolitical vise that was the ancient Levant. For a small, mountainous kingdom like Judah, nestled on the land bridge between Africa and Asia, survival was a perpetual high-wire act. To the southwest lay the ancient, resurgent power of Egypt, a civilization that viewed the Levant as its rightful buffer zone and sphere of influence. To the east, rising with meteoric force, was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the successor to the Assyrian terror, led by the brilliant and ruthless Nebuchadnezzar. Judah was a pawn on a chessboard where the pieces were empires, and its king, Jehoiakim, was a man handed a crown he did not initially possess, placed on the throne of Jerusalem by the pharaoh Necho of Egypt after he deposed his brother. This detail is crucial, for it meant Jehoiakim's very legitimacy was originally an Egyptian project, a debt that would heavily influence his fatal calculations just a few years later. When Nebuchadnezzar's armies shattered the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, the balance of power in the region swung violently and decisively. The Babylonian king marched south, and the walls of Jerusalem suddenly found themselves in the shadow of a new, unstoppable master. It was at this moment of supreme vulnerability that Jehoiakim was presented with a stark choice: surrender and swear allegiance, or face the total annihilation of his city, his temple, and his people. The treaty that was subsequently imposed was a classic example of a vassalage agreement, a legal framework that exchanged a measure of sovereignty for the promise of survival. The terms, as recorded in both the biblical Book of Kings and Babylonian Chronicles, were unambiguous: in exchange for Babylonian protection, or more accurately, a guarantee that Babylon itself would not attack Judah was required to pay a heavy annual tribute. This was not a voluntary gift. It was a calculated extraction of wealth, a continuous drain on the kingdom's treasury in the form of silver, gold, and agricultural goods, designed to enrich the imperial center while keeping the vassal state economically weak and dependent. But the obligations went far beyond economics. The treaty demanded absolute political loyalty. Jehoiakim was forbidden from engaging in any independent foreign policy, particularly from entertaining offers of alliance or support from his old patrons in Egypt. His kingdom was to be a docile and obedient satellite, its army potentially even expected to march under the Babylonian banner if called upon. Most profoundly, the agreement contained a deeply symbolic religious component. The vassal king was expected to swear an oath of loyalty in the name of Babylon's national god, Marduk, and to acknowledge, at least formally, the supremacy of the Babylonian pantheon. For a people whose entire identity was built around an exclusive covenant with a single God, Yahweh, this was a profound and humiliating spiritual violation, a demand that struck at the very heart of their national soul, creating a deep, simmering tension between the demands of political survival and the dictates of religious faith. For 3 years, Jehoiakim played the part of the compliant vassal, but the strain was clearly too much to bear. The tribute was crippling, the humiliation grated on the nobility in Jerusalem, and whispers of encouragement began to arrive from the Egyptian court, which was eager to reassert its influence and chip away at Babylonian dominance. Calculating that the distant Egyptians would provide a powerful counterweight, and perhaps believing that Nebuchadnezzar was overextended, Jehoiakim made the fateful decision to rebel. He withheld the annual tribute, a public and unequivocal act of treaty violation that was, in the language of the day, a declaration of war. This was not a decision made in a vacuum. It was a desperate gamble based on a catastrophic misreading of the strategic landscape. Jehoiakim bet that Egypt would honor its whispered promises with legions and ships, that they would arrive in time to break a Babylonian siege, and that the cost of retaking a fortified city like Jerusalem would be too high for Nebuchadnezzar to pay. It was a bet he lost spectacularly. The Egyptian military, still reeling from its earlier defeat, failed to materialize in any meaningful force. Nebuchadnezzar, a ruler who understood that the entire architecture of his empire relied on the credibility of his threats, responded not with his full force immediately, but with a more calculated, grinding pressure, sending allied raiding parties to devastate the Judean countryside, slowly strangling the rebellious kingdom while he dealt with other pressing matters. The biblical narrative paints a bleak picture of this period, a time of creeping dread as the inevitable Babylonian response gathered like a storm on the horizon. The consequences of this broken treaty were as severe as they were historically pivotal. Jehoiakim died under mysterious circumstances, perhaps by assassination, before he could face the full wrath of Babylon, leaving his young son, Jehoiachin, to inherit a doomed throne. Nebuchadnezzar's army finally arrived at the gates of Jerusalem, and the city swiftly capitulated, in a move designed to decapitate the kingdom's leadership and potential for future resistance. The Babylonian king executed a targeted deportation. He did not slaughter the general population, but he took the young King Jehoiachin, his entire royal family, the warrior class, the skilled artisans, the metal workers, and the political and religious elite, anyone with the education, skill, or lineage to organize a future rebellion, and marched them into exile in Babylon. This was imperial social engineering at its most effective, stripping a conquered land of its brain and its soul while leaving the body intact. A puppet king, Zedekiah, was installed in Jerusalem, but the lesson of Jehoiakim's rebellion was clear. When Zedekiah himself later succumbed to the same temptation and rebelled, Nebuchadnezzar's patience was exhausted. The full, terrible force of the Babylonian army was unleashed. After a brutal siege, Jerusalem was stormed, its walls torn down, and its heart, the magnificent Temple of Solomon, was reduced to smoldering rubble. The destruction was so complete and the subsequent exile so traumatic that it fundamentally reshaped Jewish identity, marking an end to the Davidic monarchy and the beginning of the diaspora, a wound in the collective memory that echoes through millennia. This tragic sequence of events offers a stark lesson in the brutal realities of ancient power politics. For a small state like Judah, a treaty with a superpower was a double-edged sword. It could indeed be a lifeline, a legal guarantee of survival in a world where being conquered often meant slaughter or mass enslavement. The vassal treaty offered a framework for coexistence, however unequal, allowing a distinct culture and religion to persist under the umbrella of imperial oversight. Yet that same treaty was also a gilded trap. The very obligations that ensured short-term safety, the crushing tribute, the surrender of foreign policy, the religious compromises, could slowly strangle a kingdom's economy and erode its political will, creating the very conditions for a desperate, last-ditch rebellion. Jehoiakim's story is a case study in this impossible dilemma. His initial submission was likely the only rational choice to avoid immediate destruction. But the terms of that submission created such internal pressure that rebellion eventually seemed like the only path to restoring national dignity and sovereignty. His fatal error was a miscalculation of the balance of power, trusting in the unreliable promise of a fading empire like Egypt over the grim, certain reality of a rising one like Babylon. The story of this treaty is a powerful reminder that in the high-stakes game of ancient diplomacy, a signature on a clay tablet was not the end of the story, but merely the opening move in a continuous, perilous test of loyalty, power, and survival. Now we venture into the sands of the Sinai, where one of history's most ambitious military campaigns hinged not on a grand battle, but on a shrewd and practical agreement made in the shadow of the dunes. The Persian king Cambyses II, son of the great empire builder Cyrus, set his sights on a prize that had tempted conquerors for centuries, the rich and ancient land of Egypt. But between his mustered armies and the Nile Delta lay a formidable and unforgiving barrier, the vast, waterless expanse of the Sinai Desert. For a massive army of tens of thousands of soldiers, along with all their horses, pack animals, and supply wagons, this desert was a potential death trap. A forced march without reliable guides or secured water sources would have been a recipe for disaster, leading to death by thirst, exhaustion, and disorganization long before the first Egyptian soldier was ever seen. Cambyses understood that his invasion could be strangled by the desert before it even began. His solution was not a purely military one, it was a diplomatic masterstroke. He turned to the one people who held the keys to this arid kingdom, the local Arab tribes, the undisputed masters of this harsh environment, who knew the location of every hidden spring and every safe path through the shifting sands. The treaty he forged with these tribal leaders was a model of pragmatic, need-based diplomacy. There were no lofty declarations of eternal brotherhood or complex clauses about dynastic succession. This was a straightforward transaction, a deal focused entirely on solving a critical logistical problem. In exchange for their invaluable services as guides and their guarantee of access to precious, life-saving water sources, Cambyses promised the Arab leaders two things they highly valued: gifts and protection. The gifts were likely substantial precious metals, fine textiles, and weaponry, serving both as immediate payment and as a symbol of Persian respect and generosity. More importantly, he offered the tribes the protection of the burgeoning Persian Empire. For peoples living on the periphery of great powers, this was an attractive proposition. It meant security from their own enemies, a recognized status, and a powerful patron. The treaty essentially created a partnership where the Arabs provided the local expertise and the Persians provided the overarching power and wealth. This agreement transformed the Sinai from an impassable barrier into a secure corridor, a testament to the idea that the most successful campaigns are often won not just with swords, but with well-negotiated contracts that address the most basic, practical needs of an army on the move. This accord reveals a critical and often overlooked dimension of ancient warfare, the absolute supremacy of logistics. Before a single tactical maneuver could be planned against the Egyptian pharaoh, Cambyses had to solve the fundamental problem of moving his force. An army, especially one of the size the Persians would have fielded, is like a massive, slow-moving city. It consumes vast quantities of water and food every single day. In the desert, the equation is brutally simple: no water, no army. A hostile local population could easily have poisoned wells, hidden oases, or led the Persians into ambushes or dead-end canyons. By securing the cooperation of the tribes through diplomacy, Cambyses effectively outsourced his entire desert logistics operation to the experts. The Arab guides knew exactly how far the army could march each day before reaching the next reliable water hole. They knew how to find and manage the scarce resources, ensuring the soldiers and animals remained functional. This treaty was the equivalent of securing a modern military's fuel and supply lines. It was the non-negotiable foundation upon which the entire invasion was built. It demonstrates that ancient generals had to be as skilled in negotiation and supply chain management as they were in battlefield command, understanding that an army marches on its stomach, and in the desert, it survives on its carefully negotiated access to water. Beyond the immediate campaign, this treaty offers a brilliant window into the Persian imperial philosophy, a key reason for their unprecedented success in governing the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Persians were masters of what we might call differentiated governance. They did not attempt to impose a one-size-fits-all model on every people they conquered or interacted with. Instead, they displayed a remarkable flexibility and cultural intelligence. When dealing with a sophisticated, urbanized civilization like Babylon, they might present themselves as the rightful heirs to the local gods and traditions. When dealing with the nomadic Arab tribes of the Sinai, they adapted their approach entirely. They recognized that these tribes were not a state to be conquered and administered, but a power to be partnered with. They understood the tribal values of honor, gift-giving, and reciprocity. By approaching them with respect and a mutually beneficial offer, rather than with threats and demands for submission, they secured a willing and highly effective ally. This ability to tailor their diplomatic strategy to the specific culture and circumstances of each group was a cornerstone of Persian power. It allowed them to incorporate an astonishing diversity of peoples into their empire, from the Greek cities of Asia Minor to the distant satrapies of India, by often allowing local customs and leaders to remain in place under the broader umbrella of Persian authority and law. The success of this pragmatic partnership was resounding. With their safe passage secured by the treaty, the Persian army crossed the Sinai Desert without the catastrophic losses that had doomed other campaigns in the past. They arrived at the Egyptian frontier not as a bedraggled, desperate force, but as a cohesive and formidable military machine, ready for battle. The subsequent conflict with the Egyptian pharaoh, Psamtik III, culminated in the decisive Battle of Pelusium, where the Persians were victorious. This victory opened the gates of Egypt to Cambyses, adding the entire Nile Valley to the sprawling Persian Empire. None of this would have been possible without that initial, pragmatic agreement in the desert. The Arab tribes, by upholding their end of the bargain, became a crucial enabler of one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of the era. This story powerfully illustrates that the boundaries of empires are not just expanded by force of arms, but are often paved by the quiet, practical treaties that solve the mundane but utterly critical challenges of geography and supply. It reminds us that history's great turning points frequently depend on the alliances forged not in palaces, but in the spaces between them, with the people who hold the real keys to the land. Following the fiery chaos of the Ionian revolt, a massive uprising of Greek cities in Asia Minor that had tested the very foundations of Persian power, King Darius I faced a critical decision. He had just spent years and immense resources crushing the rebellion, culminating in the decisive Battle of Lade and the brutal sack of Miletus. The instinctive reaction for many ancient rulers would have been to unleash a wave of pure retribution, to dismantle the city walls, execute the ringleaders, and impose a harsh, direct rule to ensure such defiance could never happen again. But Darius and his advisors chose a different, far more sophisticated path. They understood that the Ionian Greeks were not a people to be simply erased. They were a vibrant, economically vital, and strategically crucial part of the empire's western frontier. Crushing their spirit entirely would mean killing the golden goose. Instead of pure oppression, Darius opted for a policy of strategic reintegration, imposing a series of treaties that were masterpieces of calculated leniency. These agreements were not negotiated between equals, they were dictated terms from a position of overwhelming strength. Yet their genius lay in the fact that they were designed not to break the Greeks, but to bind them more securely and productively to the Persian Empire, creating a system where loyalty became more advantageous than rebellion. The terms of these treaties were a carefully calibrated blend of imperial control and local freedom. At their core were the non-negotiable demands of any empire, tribute and soldiers. Each Greek city-state was required to pay a regular, fixed tribute to the royal treasury. This was both a practical necessity, funding the imperial administration, and a constant, tangible reminder of their subordinate status. Furthermore, the cities were obligated to provide contingents for the Persian army, most notably for its formidable navy. The Greeks of Asia Minor were among the finest sailors in the world, and their ships and crews became a vital component of Persian maritime power, expected to serve in campaigns as far away as Greece itself. But alongside these demands of wealth and manpower came a crucial concession: local autonomy. Darius did not flood the cities with Persian satraps to micromanage their daily affairs. The Greeks were largely allowed to govern themselves according to their own laws and traditions. They could maintain their local governments, whether democratic, oligarchic, or tyrannical, and continue to worship their own gods and speak their own language. This was a profound psychological compromise. It allowed the Greeks to retain their cultural soul and political identity, which made the burden of Persian overlordship far more bearable than if every aspect of their lives had been forcibly Persianized. This system was held together by a sophisticated legal framework that cleverly managed the relationship between the local and the imperial. A key feature was the regulation of legal appeals. For most local disputes, property issues, commercial contracts, minor crimes, the Greek cities used their own courts and their own legal codes. However, for major cases, particularly those involving capital punishment or disputes that threatened regional stability, there was a pathway for appeal to the Persian satrap, the governor of the province, or even to the king himself. This served multiple purposes. For the Persian authorities, it was a powerful tool of oversight, allowing them to intervene in serious matters and prevent local injustices from festering into widespread discontent. For a Greek citizen, it offered a potential check on the power of their own local rulers. If you were unfairly condemned by a tyrannical local governor, you could, in theory, appeal to the distant but potentially more impartial Persian king for justice. This created a fascinating dynamic, subtly positioning the great king as the ultimate guarantor of fairness, a figure above the petty squabbles of local politics. It wove the authority of the empire directly into the legal fabric of the city-states, making the Persian crown a part of their judicial landscape. The economic dimension of these treaties was equally transformative and mutually beneficial. By formally reintegrating the Greek cities into the imperial system, Darius was plugging them back into the largest economic network the world had yet seen. The Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, and its royal road system and secure sea lanes created unparalleled opportunities for trade. A merchant from Ephesus or Miletus now had guaranteed access to the vast markets of Sardis, Babylon, and beyond. They could export their prized olive oil, wine, and finely crafted pottery deep into the interior of the empire, and import luxury goods, spices, and raw materials that were previously unavailable or prohibitively expensive. The Persian administration, in turn, benefited from the taxes on this trade and from the economic vitality it brought to the entire Western satrapy. This economic interdependence became a powerful pacifying force. A city that was prospering economically under the Persian peace had a very real material stake in maintaining the status quo. Rebellion was not just a political risk, it was a threat to the city's commercial lifelines and the personal wealth of its most influential citizens. The treaties, therefore, created a constituency for peace within the Greek world itself, aligning the interests of the local elites with the stability of the empire. When we step back and view this Persian strategy in its entirety, its sophistication becomes clear. Darius and his successors were practicing a form of imperial governance that was remarkably advanced for its time. It was a system based on the pragmatic recognition that different peoples required different approaches. They understood that outright cultural suppression was not only cruel but also inefficient and ultimately destabilizing. By allowing the Greeks of Asia Minor to remain Greek, to speak their language, run their own cities, and worship their own gods, the Persians minimized the cultural friction that often fueled resistance. This policy of incorporation created a layered identity for the Ionians. They could be proud citizens of their own city-state while also being subjects of the great king. This balanced approach stands in stark contrast to the more brutal, homogenizing methods of the Assyrians, who relied on terror and mass deportation. The Persian method was far more durable. It allowed them to govern a wildly diverse empire for centuries, not by forcing everyone to become Persian, but by creating a system where countless different cultures could thrive under a single, overarching imperial umbrella. A lesson in the subtle art of managing power through inclusion rather than sheer domination. Now we come to a truly fascinating case of ancient strategy, a partnership that was likely sealed with a handshake rather than a clay tablet. As the Persian king Xerxes I prepared for his colossal invasion of Greece in the early 5th century BCE, he was planning more than just a straightforward march into Europe. Historical sources, including the Greek historian Herodotus, strongly suggest that Xerxes reached out across the Mediterranean to the other great power of the Western Sea, Carthage. This was not a formal treaty in the sense of the detailed, curse-laden documents we've seen from the Hittites or Assyrians. No grand inscription recording its terms has ever been found. Instead, it appears to have been a strategic understanding, an informal alliance of convenience between two empires who saw a common enemy in the energetic and expanding Greek world. The brilliance of this arrangement was its grand two-front design. While Xerxes's immense army and navy would descend upon mainland Greece from the east, the powerful Carthaginian fleet and army would simultaneously launch a massive assault on the Greek colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, particularly targeting the wealthy and powerful city of Syracuse. The goal was to stretch the Greek world's military resources to the breaking point, preventing the cities of mainland Greece, especially Athens and Sparta, from receiving any aid or reinforcements from their wealthy cousins in the west. It was a pincer movement on a geopolitical scale, a plan that, if successful, could have fundamentally altered the course of Western civilization. The mechanics of this long-distance coordination are a testament to the practical realities of ancient statecraft. Without instant communication, how did two powers separated by the entire length of the Mediterranean manage to synchronize their campaigns? The answer lies in the sophisticated networks that already existed, the pathways of trade. Merchant ships were the information superhighways of the ancient world. Phoenician and Greek traders, plying the sea lanes between the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, would have carried not only goods but also news, gossip, and official messages. It is highly probable that Persian envoys traveled to Carthage on merchant vessels, disguised as traders to avoid detection, to discuss strategy and timing. These intermediaries would have negotiated the broad outlines of the plan, when the Carthaginian attack should begin to have the maximum distracting effect on the Greek world. They likely shared intelligence on Greek naval strengths, the political alliances between different city-states, and the best landing points for an invasion. This collaboration demonstrates that formal diplomacy and espionage were often two sides of the same coin. The very informality of the arrangement may have been its greatest strength, allowing for deniability and flexibility that a rigid, written treaty could not provide. This case forces us to broaden our definition of what constituted an international agreement in the ancient world. We tend to picture treaties as physical, written documents, and for many of the Near Eastern empires that was the gold standard. But the proposed Persian-Carthaginian understanding shows that a shared strategic objective could be just as binding as a written clause, at least in the short term. This was a partnership based entirely on mutual self-interest, unburdened by long-term promises or complex obligations. Xerxes needed Carthage to pin down the Western Greeks. Carthage, for its part, saw a golden opportunity to crush its primary rivals in Sicily, the Greek cities like Syracuse and Acrogas, while they were potentially isolated and unable to call for help from the homeland. There were no terms about future borders, no dynastic marriages, no lists of divine witnesses. The treaty was the plan itself, and the commitment was demonstrated through the synchronized mobilization of their respective forces. This kind of pragmatic, goal-oriented cooperation reveals a layer of diplomacy that is often invisible in the archaeological record, one that relied on trust in a shared enemy rather than trust in each other. The role of Carthage in this grand strategy also highlights its emergence as a major imperial power in its own right, one that could command the respect and seek the partnership of the mighty Persian Empire. Carthage was no mere mercenary hired by Xerxes. It was a peer power with its own extensive ambitions in the central Mediterranean. By agreeing to coordinate, Carthage was asserting its place on the world stage, demonstrating that its influence could shape events all the way from the Pillars of Hercules to the Aegean Sea. The planned dual invasion represents a moment of recognition between two non-Greek superpowers that the Hellenic world was a common obstacle to their expansion. For a brief moment, the entire Greek diaspora, from the coasts of Asia Minor to the hills of Sicily, was in the crosshairs of a coordinated plan that spanned thousands of miles. This was not a minor skirmish but a deliberate, multi-theater war aimed at the very heart of Greek civilization, and it stands as one of the most ambitious strategic concepts of the ancient world before the rise of Rome. Ultimately, the story of this unwritten pact is also a story of its dramatic failure, a failure that reveals the limitations of such long-distance, informal alliances. The plan required near-perfect timing and success on both fronts, and it achieved neither. In the east, the Persian invasion was famously halted. The Greek fleet defeated the Persians at the Battle of Salamis, and the army was turned back at the Battle of Plataea. In the west, the Carthaginian invasion of Sicily met with catastrophe at the Battle of Himera. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, this momentous battle was fought on the very same day as the Battle of Salamis. While the precise synchrony might be a literary embellishment, the general timeline is telling. The Carthaginian force, led by General Hamilcar, was decisively defeated by the tyrant of Syracuse, Gelon. The grand two-front strategy had collapsed on both ends simultaneously. The failure underscores the inherent fragility of such complex coordination in an age of slow communication. There was no way for Xerxes and the Carthaginian Senate to adjust their plans in real time, to learn from setbacks, or to redirect their forces once the campaigns were underway. The informal understanding, while strategically brilliant in conception, proved too brittle to withstand the chaos and friction of actual warfare. The fate of the alliance was sealed not by a formal breach of terms, but by military defeat on two distant battlefields, a powerful reminder that even the most clever diplomatic schemes are ultimately judged by the brutal verdict of the battlefield. After the forceful reconquest of Egypt, the Persian king Artaxerxes I faced a dilemma familiar to every empire throughout history. He could rule by the sword, imposing his will through sheer terror and oppression, a strategy that would certainly breed resentment and guarantee future revolts. Or he could try a different path, one that required more subtlety and wisdom. He chose the latter, and the treaty he established with the Egyptians stands as a brilliant case study in the power of conciliation over pure coercion. This was not a document negotiated between equals. Egypt was a defeated province, yet its terms reveal a profound understanding that the most durable control is not exerted by breaking a people's spirit, but by winning over their hearts and minds, particularly those of the most influential classes. Artaxerxes recognized that in Egypt, the true centers of power were not just the palaces, but the temples, the vast, wealthy, and deeply revered religious institutions that controlled land, resources, and the loyalty of the common people. The priesthood was the guardian of Egyptian culture and identity, and any ruler who alienated them was inviting endless trouble. The cornerstone of this ingenious treaty was a deliberate and public restoration of privileges to the Egyptian temple estates. Previous Persian rulers had sometimes been heavy-handed, seizing temple revenues and interfering in religious appointments, actions that were seen as deeply sacrilegious. Artaxerxes reversed this policy. His treaty formally gave back control of their vast landholdings to the priests, ensuring that the income from these estates would flow back into the temple treasuries rather than being siphoned off directly to the Persian crown. He also reduced the burdens of tribute and corvée labor that had been imposed on the priestly class. This was a masterstroke of political calculation. By lifting these financial pressures, Artaxerxes was not just being generous, he was making a strategic investment in the loyalty of Egypt's most powerful opinion makers. A wealthy and respected priesthood was far less likely to preach rebellion from their altars. When the very individuals who interpreted the will of the gods for the people were treated with respect and their institutions were allowed to prosper, it sent a powerful message to the entire population. Life under Persian rule could be compatible with the ancient traditions of the Nile. This policy effectively co-opted the native elite, turning potential leaders of resistance into partners in administration, or at least into neutral, contented beneficiaries of the status quo. This respectful approach extended deep into the realm of culture and daily life. The treaty demonstrated a remarkable degree of respect for Egyptian religious customs and legal traditions. The Persians did not attempt to impose the worship of Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity or force Persian legal codes onto the local populace. Instead, Artaxerxes and his officials presented themselves as pharaohs in the traditional Egyptian sense, participating in religious ceremonies, making offerings to the gods like Amun-Ra and Osiris, and having their names inscribed in cartouches on temple walls. This was more than just a hollow performance. It was a symbolic language that the Egyptians understood and respected. It signaled that the Persian king was upholding his duty to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order, a central concept in Egyptian belief. Furthermore, in local courts and disputes, Egyptian law, which had been developed over 3,000 years, was often allowed to stand for matters involving Egyptians. This cultural sensitivity was a stark contrast to the more brutal assimilation policies of other empires. It acknowledged a simple but profound truth: people will fight less fiercely for a political master they can tolerate, especially when that master protects their gods, their laws, and their way of life. Of course, this policy of cultural accommodation was not driven by altruism alone. It was firmly grounded in hard-headed economic logic. The treaty also functioned as a comprehensive commercial and fiscal agreement, carefully designed to ensure that Egypt's legendary wealth continued to flow into the imperial treasury, but in a more sustainable and efficient way. It regulated trade along the Nile and across the Mediterranean, standardizing tariffs and ensuring the safe passage of merchant ships bearing Egyptian grain, papyrus, and linen to every corner of the Persian Empire and beyond. By creating a stable and predictable economic environment, the treaty actually stimulated commerce, which in turn increased the overall tax base. The Persians were master administrators, and they understood that a prosperous province was a peaceful province. A farmer who could sell his surplus grain for a good price, or a craftsman whose goods could travel safely to market, was far less likely to join a rebellion. The treaty's tax provisions were likely structured to be less arbitrary and oppressive than before, focusing on a consistent and manageable flow of resources rather than on crippling extraction. This approach nurtured the Egyptian economy rather than plundering it, ensuring its long-term productivity and making it a reliable source of revenue for the empire for decades to come. It was the economic embodiment of the principle of ruling for the long term. The ultimate success of this strategy is measured in the peace and stability it brought. While Egypt would eventually revolt again in the future, the conciliatory rule established by Artaxerxes I secured Persian control for a significant period, allowing the province to recover and even flourish. This stands in powerful contrast to the constant, exhausting cycles of rebellion and brutal reconquest that characterized the rule of other empires like the Assyrians in the same region. The Assyrians relied on fear, on vivid displays of terror like mass deportations and public torture to compel obedience. The Persian approach under Artaxerxes, as codified in this treaty, relied on a more sophisticated form of control: the creation of a workable compromise. It proved that an empire could be strong without being relentlessly cruel, that it could assert its authority while still granting a measured degree of cultural and religious autonomy. This treaty demonstrates that the most effective empires were not always the most brutal ones, but often those that possessed the wisdom to understand the people they ruled, and the flexibility to integrate them into the imperial system in a way that felt less like subjugation and more like a partnership, however unequal it may have been in reality. But as history marched on, the relentless clash of empires began to give way to a new, more nuanced form of statecraft, one that acknowledged a shocking possibility that two great powers could simply agree to stop fighting. This brings us to one of the most intriguing and controversial documents from the classical world, the so-called Peace of Callias. Imagine the scene. For decades, the Greek world, led by the fiery and democratic Athens, had been locked in an existential struggle with the colossal Persian Empire. This was a conflict etched into the Greek soul, defined by legendary stands at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, battles that forged a pan-Hellenic identity in the crucible of resistance against the Eastern giant. Yet, by the middle of the 5th century BC, something remarkable happened. According to ancient historians, a formal peace was signed, named after the Athenian ambassador Callias, who supposedly negotiated it. The very existence of this treaty has been a subject of fierce debate among scholars for centuries, with some arguing it was a later Athenian propaganda invention to glorify their past. But whether it was a single, formal document or a series of understood agreements, the concept of the Peace of Callias represents a seismic shift in the ancient mindset, a move away from the idea of total victory and toward the pragmatic management of a stalemate between two weary but powerful rivals. The alleged terms of this peace were a masterpiece of realpolitik, carefully carving up the Aegean world into clear spheres of influence. The treaty famously drew a line in the sea, prohibiting Persian warships from sailing west of a certain point, perhaps the rocky outcrops of the Chelidonian Islands off the southern coast of Anatolia. For the Athenians, this was everything. Their security and their prosperity depended on the sea. By pushing the formidable Persian navy out of the Aegean, the agreement effectively turned it into an Athenian lake, securing the vital grain routes from the Black Sea that fed their growing population and allowing their merchant vessels to ply their trade without fear. This formal recognition of Athenian naval dominance was a staggering diplomatic achievement for a city-state that, just a few generations earlier, had been a relatively minor power. But the Persians, for their part, also secured a crucial concession. The treaty implicitly and likely explicitly recognized Persian suzerainty over the Greek city-states in Asia Minor. These cities, in Ionia and beyond, had long been a flashpoint, with Athens positioning itself as their liberator. The peace deal essentially said, "You can keep your Aegean, but we keep our mainland Greek subjects." This was a painful but practical compromise for Athens, trading the ideological goal of complete liberation for the tangible security of their maritime empire. This delicate balance of power had profound and immediate economic consequences, unlocking a period of incredible prosperity for both sides. With the constant threat of naval raids and piracy diminished by the formal peace, trade between the Greek world and the Persian Empire exploded. Athenian silver coins, stamped with their iconic owl, began to flow east in vast quantities, paying for luxury goods, exotic spices, and fine textiles from the heart of the empire. In return, the workshops of Athens produced beautiful painted pottery and other crafted goods that became status symbols for Persian nobles. This was not just an exchange of goods, it was an exchange of ideas. With merchants and travelers moving more freely, Greek philosophers, doctors, and artists gained exposure to the ancient wisdom and vast cosmological concepts of Egypt and Mesopotamia. knowledge that was filtered through the Persian Empire. This cross-pollination would profoundly influence the course of Greek science, art, and philosophy, helping to lay the groundwork for the intellectual flourishing of the later classical age. The peace created a stable environment where commerce and culture could thrive, demonstrating that a well-negotiated truce could be far more profitable for everyone than a victorious but draining war. What makes the Peace of Callias so revolutionary, if it indeed existed, is its spirit of relative parity. Unlike the treaties we've seen before, the imposed vassalage of Assyrian deals or the hierarchical agreements of the Hittites, this was an accord that treated the two powers as functional equals. The Persian Empire was still immeasurably larger and richer in terms of land and population, but the Athenian-led Delian League had proven itself to be a military and naval peer in its own arena, the Mediterranean. The treaty acknowledged this reality. It was not a victor dictating terms to the vanquished, but two exhausted champions agreeing to a draw and defining the rules of their future coexistence. This represents a maturation of international relations. It shows a recognition that perpetual conflict is not a sustainable long-term strategy, and that there are moments when the costs of continuing a war so clearly outweigh the potential benefits that even the most proud and powerful states must come to the bargaining table. The agreement signaled that diplomacy could be a tool for managing competition between rivals, not just for solidifying the control of a master over a servant. The story of this elusive peace treaty, whether grounded in historical fact or elevated legend, holds a powerful lesson for us today. It challenges the simplistic narrative that conflicts must always end with the total surrender of one side. The Greco-Persian Wars were etched in Greek memory as a cosmic struggle between freedom and despotism, a story that would seem to preclude any negotiation with the very embodiment of tyranny. Yet the concept of the Peace of Callias suggests that a more pragmatic path was possible. It encourages us to consider that after years of bloodshed and hatred, after the demonization of the enemy has become a national creed, there can still be a window for a negotiated settlement. Such an agreement requires both sides to swallow their pride, to accept compromises that feel like betrayals to their most fervent supporters, and to prioritize the tangible well-being of their people over the abstract pursuit of total victory. The enduring fascination with this treaty lies in its demonstration that diplomacy possesses the alchemical power to transform a relationship of pure enmity into one of managed rivalry, and eventually, perhaps, into a stable and even productive peace. It stands as a testament to the idea that the most profound courage is sometimes found not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table, where former enemies choose to lay down their arms and write a new, more hopeful chapter in their shared history. If the Peace of Callias represented a moment of mature, if uneasy, coexistence, the series of agreements between Sparta and Persia during the Peloponnesian War showcased diplomacy at its most ruthlessly pragmatic. Here, the lofty ideals of pan-Hellenic solidarity, so powerfully forged during the earlier Persian Wars, were unceremoniously discarded in the brutal calculus of a Greek civil war. The Treaty of Boeotius, one of several such pacts, stands as a stark monument to realpolitik, a deal where two former archenemies, Sparta and the Persian Empire, shook hands not in friendship, but in mutual recognition that the other held a key to their immediate victory. For the Spartans, locked in a decades-long death struggle with the Athenian Empire, the problem was simple and acute: they were running out of money. Their legendary army, unbeatable on the fields of the Peloponnese, was of little use against an Athenian power whose strength was its vast fleet and its impregnable long walls, which connected the city to its port. Sieges and naval warfare were astronomically expensive, and the Spartan alliance, built on land-based military service, was bleeding funds it simply did not have. They needed a financier, a sugar daddy of unparalleled wealth who could bankroll the construction and maintenance of a fleet capable of challenging Athens at sea. There was only one power in the known world with those kinds of resources, the very Persian great king whose invasion their fathers and grandfathers had died to repel. On the other side of the table, the Persian satraps, the provincial governors in western Anatolia, saw a golden opportunity in the Greeks' self-destruction. The persistent thorn in their side was the Athenian Empire, which not only supported rebellious Greek cities within Persia's domain, but whose powerful navy constantly threatened Persian control of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Persian strategy was brilliantly cynical. Why send your own soldiers to die when you can pay your enemies to kill each other? By funding Sparta, Persia could orchestrate a proxy war, draining both Greek powers until they were too weak to challenge Persian interests. The Treaty of Boeotius, therefore, was a simple transaction. Persia would provide the gold and silver necessary for Sparta to build and crew a fleet. In return, Sparta, the self-proclaimed champion of Greek freedom, made a staggering concession. It formally recognized the Persian king's sovereignty over the Greek city-states of Asia Minor. This was a complete betrayal of the very cause for which the Greeks had fought at Marathon and Salamis. It demonstrated that for the Spartan leadership, the immediate goal of defeating Athens outweighed any ideological commitment to Hellenic liberty, revealing a cold pragmatism that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The mechanics of this alliance were a masterclass in opportunistic and often messy coordination. The treaties weren't grand, singular documents meant to last for ages. They were a series of evolving agreements, renegotiated as satraps changed, Spartan admirals came and went, and the fortunes of war shifted. The clauses focused on immediate, practical needs. Persian gold would be delivered to specified ports, where Spartan commanders would use it to hire rowers, many of whom were themselves Athenians from allied states desperate for work, and to procure timber and pitch for shipbuilding. In exchange, Spartan armies operating in the region were expected to avoid plundering Persian territories and, in some cases, to actively support Persian efforts to quell rebellions in the very Greek cities they were now conceding. This created a bizarre and deeply ironic situation where Spartan hoplites, the symbol of Greek martial virtue, found themselves effectively acting as mercenaries for the Persian crown, all in the name of saving Greece from Athenian tyranny. The relationship was fraught with mutual suspicion. Spartan commanders like Lysander were brilliant at manipulating their Persian paymasters, playing rival satraps against each other to secure better funding, while the Persians were always wary of creating a Spartan force so powerful it could eventually turn against them. The alliance was less a sturdy bridge and more a rickety raft, constantly in need of repair as both parties jostled for advantage. This inherent fragility meant that violations of the treaty's spirit, and often its letter, were not the exception but the rule. The accord was a means to an end, and the moment that end was achieved or the balance of power shifted, the commitments made on parchment became instantly disposable. We see this clearly when a new Persian king, Artaxerxes II, briefly considered switching his support to Athens after Sparta showed signs of becoming too powerful. Similarly, Spartan factions often argued over the wisdom of their Persian alliance, with some seeing it as a necessary evil and others as a shameful stain on their honor. The treaties were not built on a foundation of trust or shared values, but on the shifting sands of immediate strategic necessity. They were temporary truces in a much longer Cold War between Greece and Persia, pauses in a conflict that would continue to simmer for generations. This fluidity is the defining characteristic of this phase of ancient diplomacy. Alliances were no longer seen as permanent bonds, but as tactical tools, to be picked up when useful and discarded when obsolete, a cynical but highly effective approach to statecraft in a multipolar world. The ultimate impact of this cynical partnership, however, was anything but temporary. The infusion of Persian gold was the decisive factor that broke the long stalemate of the Peloponnesian War. It was the fleet built with Persian money that enabled the Spartan commander Lysander to destroy the Athenian navy at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE. It was the financial backing of the great king that allowed Sparta to maintain a permanent naval blockade of Athens, starving the city into final surrender. The Treaty of Boeotius and its related agreements did not just influence the war, they won it. The fall of Athens and the end of its golden age of democracy can be directly traced back to the chests of Persian silver that flowed into Spartan coffers. This outcome reshaped the entire classical world, ushering in a brief period of Spartan hegemony that was itself characterized by harsh and unpopular rule, ultimately leading to further conflicts. The treaty demonstrated that in the grim arithmetic of war, financial power could be as potent as military valor, and that the balance of power could be tilted not by the strength of one's own arm, but by the depth of a benefactor's purse. Reflecting on this arrangement forces us to confront the deeply opportunistic nature of treaty making when survival is at stake. The Spartan-Persian alliance stands in stark contrast to the more structured, ritual-bound treaties of the Near East, which were often framed as eternal covenants before the gods. This was a deal made in a backroom, a purely secular and practical bargain. It reveals that for states facing an existential threat, ideology, and historical enmity are luxuries they can no longer afford. The Spartans, famed for their rigid code of honor, proved willing to compromise that very honor when the survival of their way of life was on the line. This is a timeless lesson in statecraft. Principles are often subordinate to the relentless demands of realpolitik. The Treaty of Boeotius reminds us that the history of international relations is not just a story of steadfast alliances and righteous coalitions, but also a murkier tale of convenient partnerships, moral compromise, and the cold, hard cash that so often writes the final, decisive chapter in the story of war. Having journeyed across 2,000 years and examined 22 distinct agreements, from the silver tablets of Kadesh to the cynical bargains of the Peloponnesian War, a remarkable pattern comes into focus. These were not isolated, idiosyncratic documents. They were part of a sophisticated and surprisingly consistent diplomatic tradition that spanned empires and millennia. It's as if we've uncovered a lost universal language of statecraft, where scribes from Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia were all working from a similar, unwritten playbook. The most striking of these common threads is the profound spiritual dimension that gave these treaties their binding power. Across nearly every culture we've explored, from the Hittite storm god Teshub to the Assyrian god Ashur, and even in the biblical covenant code with Yahweh, the mightiest deities of each pantheon were formally invoked as divine witnesses. This was not a mere formality or a polite nod to religion. In a world where the divine was intimately woven into the fabric of daily life and political authority, calling upon the gods transformed a political agreement into a sacred covenant. A king who broke his oath wasn't just risking a diplomatic incident. He was committing an act of sacrilege, inviting famine, plague, and military disaster upon his entire people as divine punishment. This spiritual enforcement mechanism provided a layer of psychological compulsion that no earthly penalty could match, creating a shared cosmic deterrent that held treaties together even when armies were far away. This spiritual framework was given terrifyingly concrete form through the elaborate curse clauses that concluded so many of these pacts. Whether it was the Hittites' warning of a violator being poured out like water, the Assyrians graphically describing disease and desolation, or the biblical curses of exile and destruction, the message was universally clear and visceral. These were not vague threats. They were meticulously detailed, psychologically crafted legal instruments designed to haunt the imagination of the signatories. The Assyrians, in particular, elevated this to a dark art, using curse language as a form of psychological warfare to paralyze their vassals with dread. But even in more balanced treaties, the curses served a vital legal function. They outlined the consequences of breach of contract in a language that everyone, from the king to the common soldier, could understand and fear. This shared reliance on divine retribution points to a common understanding of human nature, that the most effective way to ensure compliance was to tie a political promise to a deeply held, supernatural belief system, making the cost of betrayal feel both immediate and eternal. Beyond the spiritual realm, these ancient diplomats displayed a remarkably modern and practical understanding of what makes a relationship between states stable and prosperous. Time and again, we see that political and military agreements were inextricably linked with robust economic elements. A peace treaty was never just about stopping the fighting. It was almost always about reopening trade routes, standardizing tariffs, and guaranteeing the safe passage of merchants. The brilliant agreement between Esarhaddon and Tyre is a perfect example, where Assyrian military power and Phoenician commercial genius were fused into a single, mutually profitable partnership. Tribute, while often seen as a simple symbol of submission, was also a predictable economic transfer that funded imperial administration while leaving local economies largely intact. These were not mere plunder agreements, they were early attempts at creating integrated economic zones. By intertwining their economies, these ancient states created powerful constituencies for peace within their own societies. A merchant in Tyre or a farmer in Babylon whose livelihood depended on cross-border trade became a natural advocate for maintaining the treaty, proving that a prosperous peace is always more durable than a fragile one built on fear alone. Another fascinating commonality is the recurring appearance of formal dispute resolution mechanisms. The modern concept of international arbitration is often thought of as a recent development, but the evidence from these ancient texts tells a different story. The treaty from Alalakh explicitly required the kings to bring their disagreements before a third-party arbitrator instead of immediately reaching for their swords. The agreement between Nebuchadnezzar and the tribal confederation established a mixed council of Babylonian officials and tribal elders to adjudicate conflicts. This reveals a sophisticated legal consciousness that understood the inevitability of minor disputes and the catastrophic cost of letting every single one escalate into warfare. By building in a process for arbitration, these treaties demonstrated a preference for law over brute force, for dialogue over destruction. It was a recognition that a lasting relationship needed a way to manage friction, a safety valve that could release pressure without causing the entire agreement to explode. This commitment to a process, however rudimentary, shows that ancient statecraft was as much about building resilient systems as it was about winning individual battles. Perhaps the most telling pattern of all is the wide spectrum of relationships these treaties defined, a spectrum that ran from the fiction of brotherhood between equals to the stark reality of total domination. On one end, we have the Kadesh Treaty, where the pharaoh and the Hittite king addressed each other as brothers, signaling a relationship of parity and mutual respect. In the middle, we have the complex vassalage of the Hittite internal treaties or the Persian arrangements with the Ionian Greeks, which blended local autonomy with overarching imperial control. And on the far end, we have the brutally top-down diktats of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which were designed to humiliate and intimidate. This variation is not random. It is a precise reflection of the underlying power dynamics. The structure of the treaty itself was a diplomatic barometer, clearly indicating who held the upper hand. Yet, even in the most oppressive Assyrian treaties, the very act of writing down the terms, of creating a formal, documented set of expectations, imposed a certain minimal structure and predictability on what would otherwise be pure, arbitrary tyranny. The document itself, whether on clay, bronze, or silver, became a reference point, a piece of common ground that even a powerful empire had to at least pretend to acknowledge. When we step back and see these common elements, the divine witnesses, the economic integration, the dispute resolution, and the sliding scale of sovereignty, as parts of a single, interlocking system, the true sophistication of this ancient diplomatic language becomes breathtakingly clear. This was not a haphazard collection of ideas. It was a coherent and adaptable framework for managing international relations, a toolkit that could be customized for everything from a pact between superpowers to a deal with a nomadic tribe. The persistence of these patterns across such vast stretches of time and space suggests a vibrant network of cross-cultural exchange. Hittite scribes, Egyptian envoys, and Babylonian diplomats were clearly learning from one another, borrowing and refining clauses, and building upon a shared foundation of legal and diplomatic thought. This interconnected world of the ancient Near East, often imagined as a collection of isolated kingdoms, was in fact a crucible of international law, where the foundational rules of war and peace were being written, rewritten, and passed down through the centuries, creating a legacy of ordered statecraft that would eventually be inherited, adapted, and expanded by the empires yet to come. From the silver tablets of Kadesh to the debated accords of classical Greece, these 22 ancient treaties reveal a world where diplomacy and law were already striving to temper the brutalities of war and foster the fragile blossoms of peace. They are not merely dusty artifacts, they are the foundational precedents for international conduct, establishing a legal and moral framework that would echo through the corridors of time. The Romans, often celebrated as the great lawgivers of the ancient world, did not create their sophisticated system of international law in a vacuum. They inherited and built upon principles that had been tested and refined for over a millennium across the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Concepts like the formal declaration of war, the rights of envoys, the treatment of prisoners, and the very idea that agreements between states should be binding, all of these can trace their earliest written roots to the pacts we've explored. This legacy flowed directly into Roman law through their interactions with the Hellenistic world, which itself was deeply influenced by Persian and earlier Mesopotamian practices, and it ultimately provided a bedrock for later medieval concepts of just war and, centuries later, the modern Geneva Conventions. These ancient agreements remind us with a powerful clarity that the human quest for order, for a set of rules to govern the chaos of conflict, is as old as civilization itself. By studying these remarkable agreements, we gain far more than just historical knowledge. We acquire profound insights into enduring principles that govern human interaction on a grand scale. The central challenge of negotiation, of finding a balance between your own interests and the needs of the other party, is laid bare in the careful phrasing of the Kadesh Treaty, where two superpowers chose mutual defense over mutual destruction. The complex nature of loyalty and how it can be secured through either genuine partnership, as seen in the Hittite internal treaties, or through sheer terror, as demonstrated by the Assyrians, offers a timeless lesson in the strengths and weaknesses of different leadership models. Most importantly, these texts reveal the fundamental mechanics of conflict resolution, showing that our ancestors understood the value of arbitration over immediate violence, of written agreements over fleeting verbal promises, and of creating systems that could manage disputes without requiring total annihilation. These are not abstract historical concepts. They are the very same dynamics that play out in modern boardrooms, in international summits, and even in our personal relationships. The ancient scribes who pressed these words into clay were grappling with the same core human dilemmas we face today. I encourage you to take a moment and reflect on how these ancient lessons might inform our view of the world right now. Consider the modern diplomatic efforts to manage conflicts or the intricate trade agreements that bind our global economy. Can we see the ghost of the treaty between Esarhaddon and Tyre, where economic interdependence was used as a tool for stability in today's international partnerships? Does the cynical, short-term alliance between Sparta and Persia remind you of any contemporary geopolitical maneuvering where former enemies temporarily cooperate out of pure necessity? And on a more personal level, think about the conflicts in your own life. The principle from the Alalakh Treaty, to seek arbitration before escalation, is a powerful strategy for resolving disputes with neighbors, colleagues, or family. The idea that promises should be written down and honored, a concept so sacred to the Hittites that they invoked their gods, speaks to the fundamental importance of integrity and accountability in all our interactions. These ancient pacts show us that the tools for building a more orderly and peaceful world, whether between nations or between individuals, have been with us for thousands of years. The real challenge is finding the wisdom and the will to use them. If this journey through the very first rules of war and peace has captured your imagination, if you've been intrigued by the sight of emperors and kings trying to write their way out of perpetual conflict, then you can continue this exploration right here. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, as that helps others discover this hidden history. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the world's historical mysteries. And I am genuinely curious to hear your perspective down in the comments. Which of these 22 treaties surprised you the most? Was it the sheer age of Naram-Sin's agreement, the sophisticated logistics of Cambyses' desert pact, or the tragic consequences of Jehoiakim's failed gamble? Let's continue the conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your curiosity. It has been a true pleasure to unpack these foundational pacts with you, and I look forward to our next adventure.